As a park ranger, I learned that when hikers report seeing a ranger who looks exactly like you patrolling areas where you've never been, it's time to request a transfer. The first report came on a Tuesday in late October. I was checking trail conditions at the visitor center in Elkhorn when Logan, one of our regular hikers, approached the desk with an odd expression. "Hey Sean, I thought you were out on Bray Road this morning," he said, setting down his thermos. "I haven't been on Bray Road in weeks," I replied, feeling the first whisper of unease crawl up my spine. Logan frowned. "That's weird. I could have sworn I saw you about 2 miles in, standing just off the trail. You were looking into the woods. Didn't respond when I called out." I shrugged it off as a case of mistaken identity. Ranger uniforms look similar enough from a distance. But 2 days later, an elderly couple reported the same thing. Then a photographer. Then a family with 2 young children. All described seeing me in locations where I hadn't been, standing motionless watching the forest. By the 3rd week, I'd submitted my transfer request. Walworth County had always felt off to me, even before these incidents. Growing up in southern Wisconsin, I'd heard all the stories about the Beast of Bray Road, a werewolf-like creature that had terrified locals since the late 1980s. I never believed those tales, attributing them to overactive imaginations and the strange way darkness transforms the rural landscape. My supervisor, Nathan, denied my request. "We're understaffed as it is, Sean. It's just hikers seeing things. These woods play tricks on people's minds." I didn't argue. Nathan was retiring in a month, and his replacement, Gavin, seemed more reasonable. I'd try again then. The November. Air turned bitter as I patrolled the northern section of the county park. Leaves crunched beneath my boots, the only sound in the otherwise silent forest. Wisconsin winters came early, and the dying light filtered weakly through bare branches. My radio crackled, Nathan's voice breaking through static. "Sean, I need you at the Delavan trailhead. We've got a situation." When I arrived, 3 squad cars from the sheriff's department were parked haphazardly, lights flashing. Nathan stood talking with Sheriff Kyle Mason while deputies combed the area. "What happened?" I asked. Nathan's face was grim. "Missing hiker, college student from Madison. His friends say he ventured off trail about 3 hours ago following what he thought was a ranger." My blood ran cold. "Did they describe the ranger?" Sheriff Mason answered. "They said it looked exactly like you, which is impossible since you were conducting educational programs at the visitor center all afternoon." The search lasted until nightfall with no results. We found one of the students' gloves, a water bottle, and disturbing tracks that made no sense, some appearing human, others decidedly not. The footprints would start normally, then suddenly deepen as if the person's weight had doubled, before transforming into something with claws that disappeared into the underbrush. That night, I couldn't sleep. The wind howled outside my cabin, branches scraping against the windows like desperate fingers seeking entry. I reviewed local folklore, searching for anything that might explain what was happening. The Beast of Bray Road sightings stretched back decades, with numerous encounters, reported around Elkhorn, Delavan, and throughout Walworth County. Witnesses described a tall, fur-covered creature with wolf-like features that sometimes walked on 2 legs. Many reports mentioned glowing yellow eyes and an overwhelming stench like decaying meat. But nothing in the lore mentioned the creature, mimicking humans or creating doppelgangers. At 3:17 a.m., my phone rang. It was Owen, another ranger who patrolled the southern section. "Sean, you need to come to the station now," he said, his voice shaking. "What's wrong?" "They found the missing student's camera. You need to see the photos." 20 minutes later, I stood in the small ranger station as Owen pulled up the images on a computer. The first few showed typical hiking scenes, friends posing on trails, landscape shots of the forest. Then came a series taken after the student had apparently separated from his group. The 3rd photo from the end made my stomach lurch. It showed a figure in a ranger uniform standing about 50 yards away, back turned to the camera. The final photo was a close-up, as if the student had approached the figure. It had turned, slightly, and though the face was mine, the eyes were solid black, the skin around them cracked like dry earth. "This doesn't make sense," I whispered. Owen nodded grimly. There's more. A hiker reported something else today. She was on the trail near Spring Prairie when she saw a ranger, looking like you, standing by a massive tree. She said when the figure turned, its uniform rippled like something was moving underneath. I spent the rest of the night reviewing historical records, searching for any similar incidents. In 1936, nuns at St. Coletta Convent in Racine reported seeing a groundskeeper in multiple places simultaneously before one of their own disappeared. In 1978, 3 hikers vanished near Baraboo after reporting a park employee that wasn't right. Each incident occurred during years of increased Beast of Bray Road sightings. As dawn broke, I made a decision. If the department wouldn't let me transfer, I'd take matters into my own hands. Something was using my appearance to lure people into the forest, and I couldn't sit by while more disappeared. I packed my gear and headed toward Bray Road. If I wanted answers, I needed to find my doppelganger. Morning fog hung heavy over Bray Road as I parked my truck at the old fire service entrance. This section of forest was technically closed to the public. The trails here had been abandoned after severe storm damage 3 years ago. Perfect for whatever was impersonating me. I checked my equipment: GPS, radio, first aid kit, flashlight, knife, bear spray, and my personal Glock 22. The service weapon wasn't standard issue for Wisconsin park rangers, but after 8 years in the department, I'd secured special permission. The weight of it against my hip provided little comfort as I ventured into the mist-shrouded trees. The forgotten trail was barely visible, nature reclaiming what humans had surrendered. I documented everything on my phone: unusual tracks, broken branches, anything that might indicate something large moving through the area. For 3 hours I found nothing beyond typical forest signs: deer prints, raccoon scat, the occasional turkey feather. Around noon, I reached a small clearing where the rangers used to maintain a rest area. The wooden picnic table was rotting, split down the middle as if something heavy had crashed onto it. Nearby, a maple tree displayed unusual markings, deep gouges in the bark about 7 feet up the trunk, far higher than a bear would mark. As I photographed the claw marks, the radio on my belt crackled. I expected Nathan or Owen, but only static emerged, punctuated by what sounded like breathing. I switched channels, but the breathing continued, growing heavier. "This is Ranger Sean Winters." "Identify yourself," I demanded. The breathing stopped, abruptly. Then, through the static, I heard my own voice respond. "Ranger Winters, assistance needed. Injured hiker, Raccoon Hollow." Raccoon Hollow was nearly 2 miles northeast, a small depression in the landscape known for its rocky outcroppings. The voice was mine, but the cadence was wrong. Too measured, as if each word was being carefully selected. I knew better than to head directly there. Instead, I radioed the station. "Owen, has anyone reported an injured hiker today?" After a moment of silence, Owen responded, "Negative. All quiet today. Where are you?" "Just checking the old trails near Bray. Someone just used my voice on Channel 3 to report an injured hiker. Sean, Channel 3 has been down for maintenance since yesterday. No one could broadcast on it." My skin prickled as I surveyed the clearing. Something was watching me. I could feel it. "Owen, I need you to track my GPS position. If I don't check in every 30 minutes, send Sheriff Mason." "What's going on, Sean?" "I'm going to find out what's using my identity." Against better judgment, I headed toward Raccoon Hollow, but circuitously, approaching from the western ridge where I'd have a clear view of the depression below. The fog had lifted, but dark clouds now threatened rain. Perfect horror movie weather, I thought grimly. From my vantage point, I scanned the hollow with binoculars. At first, I saw nothing unusual, just the familiar rock formations and a small, seasonal stream nearly dry from lack of rain. Then movement caught my eye. A figure in a ranger uniform stood by the largest boulder. Even from this distance, I recognized myself. The same build, the same posture. The doppelganger was perfectly still, facing away from me, looking down at something I couldn't see. I documented everything with my phone camera, zooming in as much as possible. Through the lens, I noticed something disturbing. The uniform occasionally rippled along the back as if something beneath it was shifting position. A crack of thunder broke my concentration. When I looked back, the figure was gone. I waited 10 minutes before descending into the hollow, approaching the boulder cautiously. The ground around it told a story I struggled to comprehend. Multiple footprints, identical to my boot treads, circled the area, some pressing so deeply into the mud they must have been made by something far heavier than a human. Behind the boulder, I found a backpack. The name tag identified it as belonging to the missing student. Inside was a journal with entries, detailing his fascination with the Beast of Bray Road legend. The final entry sent ice through my veins. Following a ranger deeper into the woods, something's off about him. His movements aren't quite right. When he turned toward me just for a second, I could swear his eyes were completely wrong. But I need to know what he wants to show me. Rain began to fall as I photographed the journal and packed it away as evidence. The storm intensified quickly, forcing me to seek shelter in a small rock overhang nearby. As water coursed down the hillside, something pale tumbled from the undergrowth. Above, a human femur scraped clean. I radioed Owen immediately. "I've found evidence of the missing student and what appears to be human remains. Sending coordinates." The response was my own voice again, distorted through static. "Remain in place. Help coming." Thunder crashed directly overhead, and in the momentary illumination of lightning, I saw a figure standing in the rain just 20 yards away. My doppelganger, perfectly still despite the downpour, watching me. Another flash revealed it had moved closer, now only 15 yards away, without making a sound. Its face, my face, was expressionless, but the eyes were wrong. Not black as in the photo, but yellow with vertical pupils. I drew my Glock and shouted over the storm, "Identify yourself." The thing tilted its head at an impossible angle, nearly 90 degrees. Its mouth opened too wide, revealing teeth that no human should possess. When it spoke, it used my voice, but broken into disjointed fragments. "Sean. Winters. Help. Coming. Stay. Forest." I fired a warning shot into the air. The creature didn't flinch. Instead, it smiled, a terrible parody of my own smile, stretched too far across its face. Lightning struck a nearby tree, temporarily blinding me. When my vision cleared, the thing was gone. But a new sound rose above the storm, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from all directions at once. I retreated deeper under the overhang, weapon ready, rain soaking through my uniform. Night was still hours away, but the storm had turned the forest prematurely dark. My phone showed no signal, and the radio emitted only static interspersed with my own distorted voice repeating fragments of previous transmissions. I was alone with whatever stalked these woods, something that could wear my face and speak with my voice. Something connected to the legendary Beast of Bray Road, but far more cunning than any creature in the stories. As I waited for the storm to pass, I realized a terrible truth. I wasn't hunting it. It was hunting me. Chapter 3. Echoes in the dark. The storm persisted into evening, transforming the forest into a treacherous maze of mud and flooded depressions. I abandoned the rock overhang when water began seeping in, forced to navigate through the downpour toward higher ground. My uniform clung to my skin, each step a battle against the saturated earth trying to claim my boots. With darkness approaching and my radio useless, I had two options: attempt to reach my vehicle in failing light or find secure shelter until morning. The nearest ranger cabin was on the eastern perimeter, roughly 3 miles through increasingly hazardous terrain. My truck was about the same distance in the opposite direction. I chose the cabin. Better to have solid walls between me and whatever wore my face. The forest had transformed in the storm. Familiar landmarks were obscured by rain and shadow, forcing me to rely on my GPS. Twice I heard movement paralleling my path, something large keeping pace through the underbrush. Each time I turned my flashlight toward the sound, I caught only glimpses of retreating shadows. An hour into my trek, I found fresh tracks crossing my path, ranger boots identical to mine, but the gait was wrong. The stride length varied impossibly. sometimes 8 feet between prints, as if the creature had briefly bounded on all fours before resuming its human mimicry. The tracks led toward the eastern perimeter, exactly where I was headed. At 8:42 p.m., my flashlight caught something ahead that stopped me cold. A ranger hat, my spare from the truck, hung on a branch directly in my path, perfectly positioned at eye level. Beneath it was a small canvas bag. I approached cautiously, weapon drawn. The bag contained a Park Service radio, an older model we'd phased out years ago, and a Polaroid photograph showing Nathan, Owen, and me at last year's department picnic. Our faces were scratched out, replaced with crude yellow eyes drawn in what looked like dried blood. The radio suddenly activated, emitting a series of clicks followed by a guttural sound between a growl and speech. I nearly dropped it when my voice emerged from the speaker. Sean. Home. Waiting. The implications chilled me more than the rain. The creature knew where I was going. It was hurting me. I changed course immediately, veering north toward Jefferson County. There was an old hunting cabin owned by Jason, a fellow ranger who'd let me use it during deer season. It wasn't on any official maps. A potential sanctuary if I could reach it. The forest grew denser as I navigated by memory, and the occasional landmark visible in my failing flashlight. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the damage was done. Twice I nearly lost my footing on slick embankments, the second time sliding halfway down a ravine before catching myself on an exposed root. As I climbed back up, my light caught movement at the ravine's edge. The doppelganger stood watching me, its borrowed face now showing signs of transformation. The skin around its jaw had split, revealing dark fur and elongated teeth. Its eyes gleamed yellow in the flashlight beam. I raised my weapon, but it made no move to attack. Instead, it cocked its head as if studying me. "What are you?" I demanded. The thing's mouth moved unnaturally, struggling to form words with a jaw that was shifting between human and animal. "We are guardian, forest, protector. You've been taking people." It nodded slowly. "Trespassers, desecrators." It gestured, vaguely eastward. "They build, they cut, they poison, we preserve." A twig snapped in the darkness beyond my light's reach, then another. The creature smiled with too many teeth. "Family. Coming." I fired twice at the doppelganger. It moved with impossible speed, disappearing into the shadows as more sounds emerged from the forest around me, multiple entities converging on my position. I ran. The next hour became a desperate flight through waterlogged terrain. I abandoned stealth for speed, crashing through underbrush, splashing across swollen streams. Behind me, shadows moved between trees, sometimes on 2 legs, sometimes on 4. Yellow eyes flashed in my peripheral vision, always keeping pace, but never closing the distance, as if the pursuit itself was the point. I reached the hunting cabin near midnight, lungs burning, legs trembling with exhaustion. The small structure was dark and silent, its metal roof pinging softly with residual raindrops. I approached from the rear, circling to ensure nothing waited in the immediate vicinity. The door was locked, but Jason always kept a key hidden in a fake rock near the woodpile. My hands shook as I retrieved it, constantly scanning the tree line, where shapes seemed to shift in the darkness. Inside, I secured every window and door before allowing myself to breathe. The cabin was a single room with basic amenities, a wood stove, small kitchenette, cot, and, thank God, a shotgun mounted on the wall. I checked the breech, loaded, as Jason always kept it. I stripped off my soaked uniform and hung it by the stove, which I lit with shaking hands. As warmth gradually filled the space, I inventoried my situation. 2 weapons, limited ammunition, no working communications, and unknown numbers of creatures that could seemingly transform between human and beast lurking outside. The legends of the Beast of Bray Road had never mentioned shape-shifting or mimicry. What I faced was something folklore had failed to capture, something intelligent and organized. Around 1 a.m. I heard something on the roof, careful, deliberate movement, tracking back and forth, then scratching at the windows, subtle at first, growing more insistent. I positioned myself in the corner with the clearest sight lines to all entry points, both weapons within reach. A voice called from outside, Nathan's this time, not mine. Sean? You in there? We've been searching for you since you missed your check-in. I remained silent. Nathan wouldn't be out here alone in the middle of the night. Sean, it's not safe out here. There's been another disappearance. We need to regroup. When I didn't respond, the voice changed, becoming Owen's, then shifting to a perfect imitation of Sheriff Mason. Ranger Winters, this is an order. Open the door. The deception confirmed what I'd suspected. These creatures could mimic anyone they'd observed. I wondered how long they'd been watching us, learning our mannerisms, our voices, our patterns. Something heavy landed on the porch. The door handle turned slowly, testing my lock. When it held, a low growl of frustration vibrated through the walls. Then came a new sound, a rhythmic thumping from multiple directions. I realized with horror they were testing the cabin's structural integrity, searching for weaknesses. They found one at 2:17 a.m. The small bathroom window, reinforced, but still vulnerable, shattered inward as a massive clawed hand reached through. I fired the shotgun without hesitation. A howl of pain echoed as the appendage withdrew, taking pieces of the window frame with it. I used the moment to barricade the bathroom door with the refrigerator, but the assault had just begun. For the next hour, they tested every possible entry, point while voices called to me using familiar tones. Colleagues, friends, even my mother's voice pleading for help. The psychological warfare was effective. Exhaustion and adrenaline created a dangerous cocktail that made focusing difficult. I found myself nodding off despite the danger, jerking awake at every new sound. Dawn was still hours away when the attack suddenly ceased. The forest fell silent, save for the normal sounds of wildlife returning. Had they given up? I doubted. I used the respite to check the window they'd attacked. Blood, dark and viscous with an odd silvery quality, coated the broken glass and dripped down the wall. I collected a sample in an empty water bottle, determined to have it analyzed if I survived. As false dawn lightened the eastern sky, I caught movement through the front window. A figure stood at the forest's edge. Not my doppelganger this time, but a ranger I didn't recognize. It waved once, then turned and walked into the trees. Minutes later, my phone chirped. Service restored. 3 missed calls from Owen and a text. Where are you? Nathan missing since yesterday. Search teams mobilized. I had a signal. I could call for help. But something felt wrong about the timing. Outside, something howled, a sound between wolf and human that raised every hair on my body. It was answered by similar calls from multiple directions. They were coming back. And this time, they were coming together. First light revealed what the creatures had done while I barricaded myself inside the cabin. Arranged in a perfect circle around the structure were 11 park ranger hats, each positioned on a stake driven into the ground. At the center of the clearing stood a crude effigy made from twisted branches and clothing scraps, a human-shaped figure wearing a tattered ranger uniform. I photographed everything from the windows, documenting the macabre display while maintaining the cabin's security. My phone showed 1 bar of service, enough to send images to Owen with a text. Trapped at Jason's hunting cabin. Unknown hostiles. Send armed backup, not rangers. Verify identities. The message sent, but Owen's reply came. Back-garbled, most words replaced with random characters. Only fragments were legible. Nathan found medical, not human. Stay coming. I tried calling the sheriff's department directly. The call connected but contained only static and what sounded like distant howling. Something was interfering. With communications. The same entities that could mimic human voices seemed capable of disrupting technology when it suited them. I was effectively isolated again. I used the daylight to better fortify the cabin, moving furniture against vulnerable points and fashioning makeshift weapons from kitchen implements. The shotgun had 5 shells remaining, and my Glock held 11, rounds plus 1 chambered. Limited ammunition against unknown numbers. By mid-morning, the forest had come alive with normal sounds, birds calling, squirrels chattering. The deceptive normalcy was broken only by occasional glimpses of movement just beyond clear sight. A ranger uniform disappearing behind distant trees, a flash of yellow eyes watching from deep shadow. They were containing me, not attacking, waiting for something. I reviewed what I knew, sketching a timeline of events in a small notebook Jason kept by the wood stove. The doppelganger sightings had begun 3 weeks ago. The first disappearance occurred 5 days later. Historical records showed similar patterns stretching back decades, always in cycles. Activity for several months followed by years of dormancy. What had triggered this cycle? What had changed in the forest? The answer came when I found a faded newspaper clipping tucked inside Jason's local wildlife guidebook. 6 months ago, the county had approved development plans for the eastern section of the protected forest, a minimally invasive resort complex that would claim nearly 200 acres of old-growth woodland. They build, they cut, they poison. We preserve. The creature's words made terrible sense now. These entities, whatever they were, saw themselves as forest guardians. The development threatened their territory, and they had responded by infiltrating the human power structure responsible for forest management, the Ranger Service. By noon, the temperature had climbed uncomfortably, the cabin becoming stifling, despite the broken bathroom window. I rationed water from Jason's emergency supply, fighting exhaustion after a sleepless night. I needed to maintain vigilance, but my body demanded rest. I compromised by positioning myself in the corner with the clearest view of all entry points, propping my back against the wall with the shotgun across my lap. I would allow myself 10 minutes of closed eyes, no more. I woke to the sound of a vehicle approaching. The sun had shifted position. I'd been asleep for at least 2 hours. Cursing myself, I moved carefully to the window. A Ranger service truck was parking in the clearing, its familiar green and white paint job partially obscured by mud. Sheriff Mason stepped out, followed by 2 deputies I recognized, Ian and Ethan. All 3 were armed with service weapons and wore tactical vests. They moved with professional caution, scanning the tree line as they approached the cabin. "Sean Winters," Mason called. "We've got the place surrounded. Come out slowly with your hands visible." I watched them carefully. Their movement seemed natural, their uniforms properly worn. But after what I'd seen, I couldn't trust appearances. "Identify yourselves," I shouted through the door. Mason looked confused. "It's Sheriff Mason, Sean. You know me." "Prove it." He sighed. 2 years ago, you helped my son with a science project on forest ecosystems. He got an A, and I bought you a beer at Elkhorn Tavern. There were peanut shells all over the floor, and you kept complaining about how they stuck to your boots. It was a genuine memory, specific enough that it seemed unlikely a mimic could know it. But I remained cautious. "Why are you looking for me?" "Nathan turned up this morning wandering along Highway 12. He's in the hospital. Severe dehydration, exposure trauma. He was raving about creatures in the forest. Then we got your message." Mason stepped closer. "Sean, what's happening out here?" I weighed my options. If they were legitimate, I needed their help. If they were mimics, I was already trapped. "I'm coming out," I said. "But I'm armed and I'm keeping my weapon ready." I unlocked the door, pushing it open with my foot while maintaining distance, Glock positioned at my side but accessible. The 3 men remained where they were, hands visible. "We need to talk," I said, "but not here. These woods aren't safe." Mason nodded to his deputies, who began scanning the perimeter more intently. "We've got a tactical team assembling at the ranger station. Let's move." As we approached their vehicle, I noticed something that sent ice through my veins. The truck's rear tire had sunk slightly into the soft ground, revealing the undercarriage, which was caked with the same dark silvery substance I'd collected from the broken window. These weren't humans. I raised my weapon as Mason turned, his expression shifting from confusion to something predatory. His face rippled, the skin around his jaw splitting to reveal glimpses of what lay beneath. "You should have left when the signs began, Sean Winters," he said, his voice degrading into something guttural. The forest offered warning. The deputies were changing too, their forms becoming fluid beneath their uniforms. I fired twice at the nearest one, striking center mass. The creature stumbled but didn't fall, dark ichor seeping through its uniform. Ran for the tree line, hoping to lose them in the thick undergrowth. Behind me, clothes ripped as the entities abandoned their human guises. Howls echoed through the forest, not just from my pursuers but answered by others in the distance. They were converging. I crashed through the forest, navigating by instinct toward what I hoped was the eastern perimeter and the actual ranger station. The sound of pursuit was terrifying, not the crashing progress of humans but the fluid, almost silent movement of predators evolved for woodland hunting. A fallen tree provided momentary cover. I pressed myself against the decomposing trunk, controlling my breathing as I scanned for movement. Nothing visible, but I could sense them, patient, circling, communicating in ways I couldn't perceive. Then I saw it. Not 50 yards away stood a figure that made my blood freeze. It was me. Not the imperfect doppelganger from before, but a perfect copy down to the mud stains on my boots and the fresh scratch on my forearm from the broken window. Beside it stood Nathan, his ranger uniform torn to reveal patches of dark fur beneath. More figures emerged from the trees, some wearing ranger uniforms in various states of transformation, others fully shifted into something between wolf and human, walking upright on powerful hind legs. I counted 7 before giving up. They were assembling, forming a hunting party with my perfect double at its center. The doppelganger raised its head, inhaling deeply, then pointed directly at my position. They had my scent. I broke cover, abandoning stealth for speed. The forest became a blur as I pushed my exhausted body beyond its limits. Branches whipped my face. Roots threatened to trip me with every step, but stopping meant death. The eastern perimeter was marked by a service road. If I could reach it, I might flag down a vehicle or at least find clearer terrain for a final stand. My pursuers were gaining, their howls closer, filled with the certainty of predators who know their prey is failing. I burst through the final line of trees onto the gravel road, immediately blinded by headlights. A vehicle skidded to a stop mere feet away. The driver's door flew open and Owen leaped out, a shotgun in his hands. "Get in," he shouted, firing past me into the tree line. I hesitated for only a second. Was this another trap? But the genuine shock on Owen's face and the precise way he handled his weapon convinced me. This was the real Owen. I dove into the passenger seat as he fired once more before jumping behind the wheel. The engine roared as he accelerated, tires spitting gravel. In the side mirror, I watched my doppelganger step onto the road, surrounded by its pack. It raised a hand almost in farewell as the distance between us grew. "What the hell were those things?" Owen demanded, knuckles white on the steering wheel. "I don't know," I answered truthfully. "But they've been here all along, watching us, learning from us." As we sped toward the ranger station, I described everything I'd seen and learned. Owen listened in silence, his expression growing more grim with each detail. "Nathan's been saying similar things," he finally said. "The medical staff think it's trauma-induced psychosis. They've got him sedated." "He's not crazy," I said. "And this isn't over." Owen glanced at me. "What do you mean?" I watched the darkening forest slip past the windows, feeling yellow eyes tracking our escape from hidden depths. "They let us go," I said quietly. "They could have taken that truck if they wanted to." This was a message. What message? I thought about the development plans, about territories violated and ancient guardians awakened. That the forest has its own rangers now. The days following my escape blurred together in a haze of debriefings, medical examinations, and disbelief from authorities. Sheriff Mason, the real one, listened to my account with professional courtesy but clear skepticism. The missing student's body was recovered from a ravine near Raccoon Hollow. His death attributed to exposure and injuries consistent with a fall. No mention was made of the evidence I'd found, or the journal entries describing a ranger doppelganger. Nathan remained hospitalized, heavily sedated whenever his delusions became too vivid. Only Owen believed me, having glimpsed the creatures himself during my rescue. We kept our theories private, recognizing that the truth would sound like madness to anyone who hadn't witnessed it firsthand. 3 weeks after the incident, I sat in my apartment reviewing the evidence I'd secretly gathered: photographs, samples of the silvery blood, historical records of similar occurrences stretching back decades. The pattern was undeniable once you knew what to look for. Disappearances and ranger doppelganger sightings always preceded major development projects in the forest. The doorbell rang, interrupting my thoughts. I approached cautiously, weapon within reach, a habit I'd developed since returning to civilization. Through the peephole, I saw Gavin, Nathan's replacement as head ranger. I opened the door, but blocked the entrance. "Gavin, didn't expect to see you off duty." He smiled tightly. "We need to talk, Sean. May I come in?" I studied him carefully. No signs of the unnatural movement that had betrayed the mimics before. But I'd learned to trust nothing. "What was the first thing you said to me when you joined the department 4 years ago?" I asked casually. His expression remained neutral. I asked if the coffee was always that bad, or if someone was playing a joke on the new guy. I stepped aside, allowing him entry but maintaining distance. Gavin glanced at the evidence spread across my dining table but made no comment as he took a seat on my sofa. "The county council is voting tomorrow on the resort development," he said, without preamble. "I know. Your testimony about unusual activity in the forest has some of them concerned." He leaned forward. "They sent me to assess whether you're stable enough to return to duty." I laughed bitterly. "You mean they want to know if I'm going to cause problems at the vote? Something like that." Gavin studied me. "Nathan's being transferred to a specialized facility next week. Long-term care." The implication was clear. Continue pushing this story and I'd face the same fate. "What do you want from me, Gavin?" "The truth." His expression softened slightly. "Off the record, man to man, what really happened out there?" I considered my options. Gavin had always been reasonable, pragmatic. He'd also spent years in these forests before transferring to our department. If anyone might be receptive to the truth, I told him everything. The doppelgangers, the transformations, the territorial message. As I spoke, his face remained impassive, offering no clue to his thoughts. When I finished, silence hung between us. Finally, he sighed. "I believe you." Before I could respond, he continued. "In my previous posting in Jefferson County, we had similar incidents. Rangers reporting seeing themselves in impossible locations, hikers describing unusual encounters. Management buried it, attributed it to stress or wildlife misidentifications." Hope flared briefly. "Then you'll help me stop the development?" Gavin shook his head. "I'll help you understand what you're dealing with. These entities, they're not mindless beasts, Sean. They're guardians with an ancient claim to the land. Fighting them directly would be suicide. So we just let them take people? Let them continue this infiltration? No. We establish boundaries. Mutual respect." He reached into his jacket, removing a folder. "These are the original development plans. The resort would have claimed this entire section of old-growth forest." He opened the folder, revealing detailed maps. Yesterday, the developers suddenly submitted revised plans, cutting the footprint by 80% and preserving all the oldest sections of forest. No explanation given, just a complete reversal of their previous position. I stared at the maps, understanding dawning. They were approached. Gavin nodded. "The CEO canceled a press appearance 2 days ago. When he resurfaced, he seemed changed, more environmentally conscious, he claimed. Spiritual awakening. Or he met something in the woods that showed him alternatives to his plans," I suggested. "Exactly." Gavin collected the maps. "The vote tomorrow will approve the revised development. Limited human encroachment, most of the forest preserved, a compromise. And the disappearances? The mimicry? Will likely stop once the territorial dispute is resolved." He met my gaze directly. "Unless we provoke them again." After Gavin left, I sat alone with this new understanding. The creatures weren't mindless killers. They were guardians employing terror as a negotiation tactic. Effective, if brutal. The next morning, I attended the county council meeting. The revised development plans passed unanimously, celebrated as a win for both progress and conservation. I watched the CEO speak passionately about environmental stewardship, noting the unnatural stillness in his movements. and the occasional yellow flash in his eyes when the lights hit them at certain angles. 1 week later, I returned to duty. The doppelganger sightings had ceased completely. Nathan was transferred to the facility upstate, his experience reduced to a cautionary tale about the dangers of solo night patrols. The missing student's case was closed, his death officially an accident. Life in Walworth County returned to normal, or what passed for normal when you knew what really lived among the ancient pines. On my first patrol of the eastern perimeter, I found a ranger hat placed carefully on a fallen log near the new boundary line, established by the revised development plan. Beneath it lay a Polaroid photograph of me standing at my apartment window, a reminder that I was still being watched. I left the hat and photo untouched, but placed beside them my ranger badge, a gesture of recognition, a promise to respect their territory if they respected ours. As I turned to leave, I caught movement at the forest's edge, a familiar silhouette watching me. My doppelganger raised a hand in acknowledgement before melting back into the shadows of its domain. I understood the message clearly. The forest would always have its guardians. Some wore ranger uniforms with badges. Others wore ranger faces with yellow eyes. As I drove back toward the station, I passed the Welcome to Walworth County sign with its cheerful slogan, "Where nature and community thrive together." I couldn't help but smile at the unintentional truth of those words. Community. Indeed, human and otherwise negotiating an uneasy peace in the shadow of the ancient pines. My name is Michael Kane, but the Cherokee side of my family calls me Kanati, guardian of the hunt. It's a name that carries weight in these ancient mountains of western North Carolina, where my great-grandmother's stories still echo through the hollows like morning mist. She used to tell me that names have power, that they shape who we become. Standing here now 20 years later wearing the badge of a U.S. Forest Service Ranger, I understand what she meant. The radio crackled to life on my desk, interrupting my morning coffee and the stack of incident reports I'd been avoiding. "Ranger Kane, we have a possible missing persons case. Group of hikers failed to return from the Appalachian Trail section near Cataract Falls." I keyed the mic. "Copy that. How many in the party?" 4. 2 couples from Atlanta. They were due back yesterday evening. I glanced at the calendar hanging above my desk. September 21st. The autumn equinox. My great-grandmother would have said it was a significant day, a time when the veil between worlds grows thin. The Cherokee calendar marks this as a period of balance, but also danger. The old stories speak of creatures that emerge during such times, drawn by the shifting energies that most people can't feel but never fail to affect them. "Any last known location?" I asked. "Trail marker 47, approximately 2 miles north of the falls. They were registered for a 3-day camping trip. Trail marker 47. I knew that area well, too well. It was where I'd had my first encounter. 3 years ago, the memory still sent ice through my veins. The feeling of being watched by something just beyond the tree line. The way the forest fell silent, as if every living thing was holding its breath, waiting. I'd found massive footprints in the soft earth near the creek, each one nearly 18 inches long with distinct toe impressions. The prints had vanished into the rocky terrain, but the feeling of those unseen eyes following me had lasted for miles. "Roger. I'll head out within the hour." I gathered my gear methodically. Emergency medical supplies, rope, GPS unit, my grandfather's hunting knife, a blade he'd carried in Korea and had blessed by the tribe's medicine man before passing it to me. Most importantly, I grabbed the small leather pouch my great-grandmother had given me before she passed. Inside were sacred tobacco, sage, and a small piece of black obsidian. "For protection against the things that shouldn't be," she'd whispered, with her dying breath. The drive to the trailhead took me through territory that had been Cherokee land for 1,000 years before the first white settlers arrived. The mountains here are different from the tourist-friendly peaks further south. These are the old mountains, shrouded in legends that predate European contact by centuries. My people called this region Envi Gigaiviga, the place where the giants walk. The stories speak of the Kekle Kudla, massive hair-covered beings that served as guardians of the forest's deepest secrets. I parked at the trailhead and noticed immediately that something was wrong. The forest was too quiet. No bird songs, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Even the insects seemed muted. In my training, we learned that animals are the first to sense danger. When the forest goes silent, you listen. The trail leading to Marker 47 wound through increasingly dense woodland. Ancient hemlocks towered overhead, their branches intertwining to block out most of the afternoon sun. Patches of fog clung to the hollows despite the late hour, creating an otherworldly atmosphere that made me instinctively check over my shoulder every few hundred yards. I found the hikers' campsite easily enough. Their gear was scattered in a way that suggested a hasty departure rather than an organized pack-up. 2 tents, 1 partially collapsed sleeping bag spilled out onto the ground. A camp stove sat cold beside the remnants of what looked like an interrupted meal. But it was the tracks that made my blood run cold. Mixed in with the boot prints of the missing hikers were others, barefoot impressions nearly twice the size of human feet with elongated toes and a heel that pressed deep into the soft earth. The stride length was impossible for any human, each step covering nearly 6 feet of ground. The prints led away from the campsite and deeper into the forest, following a game trail that I knew eventually connected to a series of limestone caves. Followed the trail for nearly a mile before the tracks became harder to read on the rocky terrain. The path descended into a hollow I'd never fully explored, despite years of ranging these mountains. The air grew noticeably cooler as I descended, and I caught a smell that raised every hair on the back of my neck. A musky, organic odor that reminded me of wet animal hide mixed with something else, something that spoke to a primal fear buried deep in human DNA. The hollow opened into a small clearing dominated by a ring of standing stones. Not natural formations, these had been placed by human hands, though clearly not recently. Moss and lichen covered their surfaces, and some bore carved symbols that I recognized from my great-grandmother's stories. Cherokee petroglyphs, but older than anything I'd seen before. At the center of the ring stood a single oak tree, its trunk easily 8 feet in diameter, its branches reaching toward the darkening sky like gnarled fingers. And hanging from those branches were pieces of clothing. A red hiking boot, a torn jacket sleeve, a baseball cap with the Atlanta Braves logo, fresh enough that they hadn't yet been weathered by rain or sun. My radio crackled to life, making me jump. "Ranger Kane, what's your status?" I keyed the mic, with trembling fingers. "I found evidence of the missing party. Going to need backup and a search team." "Copy that. ETA on backup is 2 hours. 2 hours. In this place, with darkness falling and the blood moon rising above the mountains, 2 hours felt like an eternity. I was about to key the mic again when I heard it, a sound that had haunted my dreams since that day 3 years ago. A low, resonant call that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Not quite human, but not quite animal either. It echoed off the limestone walls of the hollow, creating harmonics that made my chest vibrate. The call was answered from somewhere to my left, then again from my right. I was surrounded. My great-grandmother's voice whispered in my memory. "The giants are guardians, Kanati, but they guard things that were never meant for human eyes. When you hear their voices calling in the darkness, you must choose. Will you run, or will you stand and face what guards the threshold between worlds?" I reached for the medicine pouch at my belt and stepped deeper into the circle of stones. The missing hikers were out there somewhere, and my badge, my name, demanded that I find them. Whatever lurked in these ancient woods would have to be faced. The Cherokee word Kanati doesn't just mean guardian of the hunt. It means guardian against the things that hunt us. The blood moon crested the treetops, bathing the hollow in crimson light, and the forest began to whisper with voices that predated civilization. My radio hissed with static as the electromagnetic interference intensified, a phenomenon I'd learned to associate with their presence. I was no longer just a park ranger investigating a missing persons case. I was a Cherokee warrior, entering the realm of legends. The blood moon cast everything in shades of rust and shadow as I made my way deeper into the hollow. My flashlight beam seemed feeble against the supernatural crimson glow filtering through the canopy. Every step took me further from the rational world of incident reports and search protocols, and deeper into the realm of my ancestors' warnings. The clothing hanging from the oak tree branches swayed gently in a breeze I couldn't feel. As I approached, for a closer look, I noticed that the items weren't torn or damaged. They appeared to have been carefully removed and placed there deliberately. The red hiking boot still bore its laces, tied in the precise knots favored by experienced hikers. The jacket sleeve showed no rips or tears, just clean separation at the seam. I photographed everything with my phone, though I doubted the images would come out clearly in this strange light. The electromagnetic interference was getting stronger. My GPS unit flickered between readings, sometimes showing my location as miles from where I knew I stood. A twig snapped behind me. I spun around, hand instinctively moving to the pistol on my hip, but stopped when I saw her. An elderly Cherokee woman stood at the edge of the clearing, wearing traditional dress that seemed to absorb the moonlight. Her silver hair was braided with eagle feathers and small bones. She shouldn't have been there, couldn't have been there. The hollow was accessible only through the narrow game trail I'd followed, and I would have heard anyone approaching. "Sio Kanati," she said, using the traditional Cherokee greeting. Her voice carried the weight of years and the accent of someone who had learned English as a second language. "You have come to the old boundary. Ma'am, you need to leave this area," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. Something about her presence felt both comforting and terrifying. "There's a search operation in progress." She smiled, revealing teeth that were too white and too sharp. "I am Nanyehi Atsadi, granddaughter of the mountain spirits. I have been waiting for you to find your way here." The name struck me like lightning. Nanyehi, Nancy Ward, was a Cherokee war woman who had died in 1822. Atsadi meant wisdom. This woman claimed to be the granddaughter of spirits, which in Cherokee cosmology would make her something far more than human. "The 4 lost ones crossed the boundary 3 nights ago," she continued, gesturing toward the stone circle. "They were drawn by dreams that are not dreams, called by voices that speak in frequencies your kind cannot hear. But you hear them, don't you, grandson of the old blood?" I nodded slowly. The haunting calls had grown quieter but not stopped, creating a sonic backdrop that seemed to vibrate in my bones. "Where are they?" "In the space between spaces, walking with the Kekle Kudla. Your people have many names for them. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, Wood Ape. But we have known them since before the ice came south. They are the keepers of the compact, the agreement made when your ancestors first walked these mountains." She moved closer, and I could see that her eyes held depths that seemed to extend beyond the physical. When she spoke, her breath carried the scent of sacred fires and ancient ceremonies. "Your great-grandmother spoke truly when she said names have power. You carry the name of the first hunter, the guardian who was charged with maintaining the balance between the world of men and the world of others. That responsibility has awakened in your blood, called forth by the breaking of the old boundaries." "What compact?" I asked, though part of me already knew. The stories my great-grandmother had told, the ones I'd dismissed as folklore, suddenly felt as solid as the stone circle around us. When the Cherokee first came to these mountains, we found them already inhabited. The Kekle Kudle are older than our memories, older than the stories we tell to children. They agreed to withdraw to the deep places, the caves and hidden valleys, in exchange for our promise to guard the boundaries and ensure that certain truths remained hidden from those who would exploit them. A bone-deep howl echoed from somewhere, in the darkness beyond the clearing, followed by another, then another. The electromagnetic interference spiked, causing my radio to emit a harsh screech before falling silent. "The world has changed," Nanyehi continued. "Your people spread across the land like floodwater, bringing machines that pierce the earth and minds that refuse to believe in anything they cannot measure. The compact weakens with each generation that forgets the old ways. And when the boundaries fail," she gestured toward the oak tree where the clothing still swayed in the phantom breeze. "People disappear? Some disappear, others return, changed. The 4 who crossed 3 nights ago, they will be given a choice. They can remain in the shadow realm, becoming guardians themselves, or they can return to your world carrying knowledge that will either drive them to madness or force them to become protectors of secrets. I thought of the dozens of missing persons cases I'd worked over the years, the ones where we'd found no trace despite extensive searches, and the few where we'd found survivors who spoke of time distortion and impossible encounters before falling silent under the weight of disbelief from family and authorities. What choice do I have here? I asked. The same choice your ancestors faced. You can turn away, file a report about hikers who became lost and may never be found, and return to your small world of policies and procedures. Or you can honor your name and step through the boundary to bring them back. She pointed to a gap between two of the standing stones that I hadn't noticed before. The space seemed to shimmer like heat waves, and through it I could see not more forest but a landscape that defied description, trees that moved without wind, starless sky that pulsed with colors I had no names for, and in the distance, massive, shapes moving between the twisted trunks with grace that belied their enormous size. If I go through, can I come back? That depends, Nanyehi said, on whether you can remember that you are Kanati, guardian of the hunt, and not simply Michael, Kane Forest Ranger. Names have power, grandson. Your true name is the key to walking between worlds and finding your way home. The howling grew louder, more insistent. In the strange harmonics, I began to hear something that sounded almost like words, though spoken in no language I recognized. The missing hikers' voices, perhaps, calling from beyond the boundary that separated the rational world from the realm of legends. My radio crackled back to life with weak, staticky voice. Ranger Kane, status, back up en route, respond. I looked back toward the trail that would take me to safety, to backup, to a world where missing persons cases were solved with search dogs and helicopters rather than ancient compacts and supernatural guardians. Then I looked at the shimmering portal between the standing stones where 4 people waited in a place that shouldn't exist for rescue by someone who carried a name older than the mountains themselves. If I don't come back, I said into the radio, tell them I was honoring my family name. Nanyehi smiled and began to fade like morning mist. Remember, Kanati, in their realm, belief shapes reality. What you expect to find will become what you find. Trust in the old ways, and the old ways will trust in you. I stepped through the gap between the stones and felt the world dissolve around me. The boundary between legend and reality didn't break. It simply shifted. The transition between worlds felt like stepping through a curtain of static electricity that left every nerve ending tingling. One moment I stood in, a forest hollow bathed in blood moonlight. The next I found myself in a realm where the laws of physics bent like tree branches in a storm. The air here was thicker, almost tangible, carrying scents of loam and living things that had never known. The touch of sunlight. Above, instead of a star-filled sky, a dome of swirling aurora danced in colors that hurt to look at directly. Purples so deep they bordered on black, greens that pulsed with their own inner light, and veins of silver that moved like living things across the ethereal canvas. The trees were familiar yet wrong. Oaks and maples I recognized but twisted into impossible configurations. Trunks that spiraled upward in perfect helixes, branches that wove together into complex geometric patterns, roots that extended above ground level to form natural bridges and arches. Everything was larger here, as if the forest had been designed for inhabitants far bigger than humans. And those inhabitants were everywhere. I saw them first as shadows moving between the twisted trunks, massive bipedal forms that flowed through the forest with surprising grace. 8 feet tall at minimum, some considerably larger, covered in dark hair that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Their eyes glowed with a soft amber radiance that reminded me of moonlight on still water. The Keklakudla, the giants of Cherokee legend, guardians of the boundary between worlds. One of them approached, moving with deliberate slowness that I recognized as a gesture of non-aggression. Up close, its features were even more unsettling, undeniably ape-like, yet possessing an intelligence that shone through those glowing eyes. When it spoke, the words bypassed my ears entirely and resonated directly in my mind. Welcome, Guardian of the hunt. We have been waiting. The voice carried harmonics of wind, through stone, water over granite, the deep patience of geological time. I found I could respond in the same manner, my thoughts taking on weight and substance in this place where intention mattered more than physics. I've come for the lost ones, I projected. They are not lost. They have found more than they sought. But come, see for yourself. The creature, I realized I couldn't think of them as mere animals, not with that level of intelligence, turned and began walking deeper into the shadow realm. I followed, noting that my footsteps made no sound on the forest floor, as if the very ground absorbed all disturbance. We walked for what felt like hours, but could have been minutes. Time moved strangely here, measured not in moments, but in intentions and purposes. The electromagnetic interference that had plagued my equipment in the normal world was absent. Instead, everything hummed with a different kind of energy, older and more organic. Eventually, we came to a clearing where the 4 missing hikers sat in a circle around a fire that burned without consuming fuel. They appeared unharmed but fundamentally changed. Their eyes held the same depths I'd seen in Nanyehi's gaze, as if they'd been looking into infinity and found it looking back. Sarah Mitchell, a 34-year-old marketing executive from Atlanta, looked up as we approached. When she spoke, her voice carried new harmonics, as if she'd learned to speak in frequencies that touch the soul as well as the ear. Ranger Kane, she said, somehow knowing my name though we'd never met. We've been expecting you. Her husband David sat beside her along with the other couple, Tom and Jennifer Walsh. All 4 showed the same transformation, a depth of awareness that seemed to extend beyond the merely human. Are you injured? I asked, falling back on my training. Your families are worried. We need to get you back. Back to what? David asked. To lives spent in cubicles, staring at screens, pretending that quarterly reports and stock prices matter when there are worlds like this existing parallel to our own. They have been offered the choice, the Keklakudla communicated to me, as is traditional when humans cross the boundary willingly. What choice? I asked aloud. Tom Walsh answered. To return to our old lives with the knowledge that everything we thought we knew about reality was wrong, or to remain here and become guardians ourselves, bridges between the worlds, helping to maintain the balance. You have families, I said. Jobs, responsibilities. I had a family, Jennifer said softly. My daughter died 3 years ago, leukemia. Do you know what it's like to watch a child die from something that could have been cured if we hadn't spent generations destroying the very forests that hold the cure? The Keklakudle showed me plants here that could heal anything, but they can't exist in our poisoned world. I felt the weight of their dilemma. In this realm, every word carried emotional resonance that made lies impossible and truth unavoidable. Jennifer's grief was a palpable thing, as real as the aurora dancing overhead. The choice is not permanent, the Keklakudle explained. Those who remain may return to your world when needed. Those who leave may come back when called. But the boundary grows weaker with each passing season. Soon, there will be no choice at all. Either the worlds will merge chaotically, or they will separate forever. What about the compact? I asked. The agreement between the Cherokee and your people? The creature's thoughts carried what could only be described as profound sadness. Your grandmother's people honored their part for many generations. But the Cherokee nation was broken, scattered, forced onto distant lands. Those who remained forgot the old ways, adopted new gods, new purposes. The compact survives only in bloodlines like yours, individuals who carry both the memory and the responsibility. I understood then why I'd been drawn to this place, why my great-grandmother had given me that medicine pouch, why the name Kanati had never felt like just a family tradition but like a burden and a calling. The 4 of you, I said to the hikers, you're being asked to become part of the compact, to help maintain the boundary. Sarah nodded. But we can't make that decision for you. The Guardian must choose as well. Will you honor your name, Kanati? Or will you return to your world and let the boundaries collapse? Through the canopy of twisted branches, I could see shapes moving in the distance. More of the Keklakudle, dozens of them, perhaps hundreds. This realm was larger than I'd imagined, populated by beings whose very existence challenged everything the modern world claimed to believe about the nature of reality. My radio crackled to life. Somehow, impossibly, it was receiving signals across dimensions. "Ranger Kane, this is base. Backup has reached the trailhead. What's your location?" The static-filled voice of my supervisor seemed to come from another universe entirely. In a sense, it did. "The choice must be made now," the Kekle Kudla communicated. "Dawn approaches in your world. The boundary will close until the next turning of the seasons." I looked at the 4 transformed hikers, then at the massive being whose species had walked these mountains since before human civilization began. The weight of centuries pressed down on me. Generations of Cherokee who had honored the compact, maintained the balance, kept the secret that protected both worlds from chaos. "If I stay," I asked, "who will guard the boundary from the other side?" "There are others. Few, but they exist. Those who carry the old blood, the old knowledge. They will be drawn to take up the watch." My great-grandmother's stories whispered in my memory. Other families, other bloodlines, scattered across the country but connected by purpose and ancestry. The network she'd hinted at, but never fully explained. The radio crackled again. "Ranger Kane, respond. We're organizing a full search and rescue operation." I keyed the mic, feeling the weight of the decision settle on my shoulders like a mantle passed down through generations. "This is Ranger Kane," I said. "The missing hikers are safe, but the situation is complicated. I need more time." "Negative, Kane. Return to base immediately." I looked at Sarah, David, Tom, and Jennifer, 4 ordinary people who had stumbled into extraordinary circumstances and now faced a choice that would define not just their futures, but the fate of 2 worlds. "Time is the one thing we don't have," I said, and turned off the radio. The decision was made. Now came the hard part. Living with it. In the Shadow Realm, dawn was a different thing entirely. Not the gradual brightening of sky that marked morning in our world, but a subtle shift in the aurora's dance, a change in the quality of the light that filtered through the impossible geometry of the twisted trees. Time moved differently here, measured not in hours but in moments of significance, decisions that rippled across dimensions. The Kekle Kudla who had guided me. I had begun to think of him as the speaker, for he seemed to be the one designated to communicate with humans, gestured toward a section of forest I hadn't noticed before. Through the trees I could see structures that defied easy description, buildings that seemed to grow from the living rock, their walls formed from crystalline deposits that pulsed with the same ethereal light as the aurora above. "Come," the speaker projected. "There is much you must understand before the boundary closes." We walked, the 4 transformed hikers, myself, and our massive guide, toward what I could only think of as a city, though it bore no resemblance to any human settlement. The buildings rose in organic spirals, connected by bridges that looked like fossilized lightning, their surfaces covered in symbols that hurt my eyes to look at directly, but somehow conveyed meaning on a level deeper than language. "This is the archive," the speaker explained as we approached the largest structure, the repository of knowledge gathered across the centuries by those who walk between worlds. Inside, the building was even more disorienting. Shelves that extended infinitely upward and downward held not books, but crystalline matrices that glowed with stored information. The air itself seemed thick with accumulated wisdom, making each breath feel like an education. Other beings moved through the archive, not all of them Kekle Kudla. I saw entities that were clearly not human, but possessed an intelligence that transcended mere animal awareness. Creatures of living shadow that flowed like liquid darkness, beings of pure light that left after images when they moved, and things so alien that my mind simply refused to process them into coherent forms. "The compact between your people and mine," the speaker continued, "was never just about these mountains. It was about maintaining the barriers that keep the dimensions from merging chaotically. Your world and ours exist in parallel, but there are others, many others. Without guardians to maintain the boundaries, They would collapse into each other, creating chaos beyond imagination. Sarah Mitchell approached one of the crystalline matrices, her transformed senses allowing her to interface with it directly. As she touched the surface, images flowed through the crystal, visions of other times, other places where the boundaries had failed. "My God," she whispered. "The Bermuda Triangle, the disappearances in national parks, the places where people vanish without a trace." She turned to face us, her eyes wide with understanding. "They're not random. They're breach points where the boundaries are thin. Your species is approaching a critical juncture," the speaker confirmed. "Your technology grows powerful enough to tear holes between dimensions, but your wisdom has not grown to match. The electromagnetic fields generated by your machines weaken the barriers. Soon, maintaining the boundaries will require active intervention rather than passive guardianship." David Walsh was examining another section of the archive, his transformed perception allowing him to read symbols that would have been meaningless to normal human consciousness. "There are others like us," he said, "people who've crossed over and chosen to stay. They're not just missing persons. They're recruits in a war most people don't know is being fought." The weight of responsibility settled on my shoulders like a physical thing. My great-grandmother's stories had hinted at this, the suggestion that our family's role as guardians was part of something much larger than protecting local mountain folklore. "What about those who choose to return?" I asked. "The hikers who disappear and come back with stories no one believes. They serve a purpose as well," the speaker projected. "Their accounts, though dismissed as fantasy or delusion, plant seeds in human consciousness. They prepare your species slowly and gradually for the revelation that your world is not the only reality." Tom Walsh looked up from a display that showed shifting patterns of light and energy. "This is beautiful and terrifying. At the same time," he said, "but I have a wife, children. How can I abandon my responsibilities to them for this?" "The question," the speaker replied, "is whether your responsibilities to them are better served by returning to ignorance or by helping to ensure their world continues to exist." It was a harsh truth, but one that resonated with the enhanced awareness we all shared in this place. The boundaries between dimensions weren't just philosophical concepts. They were the foundation upon which reality itself rested. I thought of my own life back in the normal world. My job as a forest ranger, my small apartment, the routine of daily existence that had felt so important just hours ago. Against the backdrop of interdimensional warfare and the preservation of reality itself, it all seemed insufficient. "What would staying here actually mean?" Jennifer asked. "What would we become?" The speaker gestured toward a section of the archive where other transformed humans worked alongside the alien entities. "You would become bridges," he explained, "translators between species and dimensions. Your human perspective is valuable precisely because it is human. You understand both worlds in ways neither pure humans nor pure Quetzalcoatl can." I watched one of the transformed humans, a woman who might have been in her 40s when she crossed over, though time moved differently here, communicating with a being of living light through a combination of gesture, telepathy, and what looked like controlled electromagnetic fields. She noticed my observation and approached. "I was a physicist," she said, her voice carrying the same enhanced harmonics as the missing hikers. "I disappeared from a research facility in Nevada 15 years ago. My colleagues thought I was dead. In a way, I suppose I was. The woman who lived in that limited reality died when she learned how vast the true universe actually is." "Do you ever regret the choice?" I asked. She smiled, and for a moment, her transformed features showed a glimpse of the human she had been. "I regret that I can't share this knowledge with everyone, that most humans will live and die never knowing how magnificent existence really is. But regret the choice itself? Never." My radio crackled to life again, the signal somehow penetrating the dimensional barrier. "Ranger Kane, this is search and rescue. We're at your last known position. Where are you?" The voice of my supervisor carried an edge of panic. In the normal world, I'd been missing for nearly 12 hours, long enough for a full-scale operation to be launched, long enough for my absence to be noticed by family and friends. The 4 hikers looked at me with expressions that mixed understanding with sorrow. They knew as I did that every moment we delayed made our eventual return to the normal world more difficult to explain. The boundary closes at the next turning, the speaker projected. The decision must be made. I looked around the archive at the accumulated wisdom of millennia, at beings who had transcended the limitations of single-world existence. Then I thought of the world I'd left behind, flawed, limited, but populated by billions of people who deserved a chance to continue existing, even in ignorance. If I go back, I asked, how will I maintain the boundary from the other side? Same way your ancestors did. Through vigilance, through the preservation of sacred sites, through the cultivation of those bloodlines that carry the ancient knowledge. The work is harder now. Your people's machines disrupt the natural barriers, but it is not impossible. The transformed physicist approached me, her enhanced senses reading the conflict in my aura. The choice isn't permanent, she said. The boundaries open regularly for those who know how to find them. You can return to fulfill your guardian duties here when needed. I understood then that the choice wasn't between worlds, it was between roles. Stay here and become a bridge between dimensions, or return to serve as a guardian on Earth, protecting the boundary from the other side. Both were necessary. Both were forms of service. I keyed my radio. This is Ranger Kane. I have located the missing hikers. We're going to need some time to extract them safely. The terrain is challenging. Roger that, Kane. What's your location? I looked at the speaker, at the four transformed humans, at the alien beings who worked tirelessly to maintain the structure of reality itself. We're exactly where we need to be, I said. I'll update you when we're ready for pickup. The boundary shimmered, waiting for our final decision. Dawn was coming to both worlds, and with it, the moment when words would become action. The moment of choice arrived not with fanfare but with a subtle shift in the ethereal aurora above, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. In the archive, the crystalline matrices pulsed with increased intensity, their stored knowledge seeming to strain against containment. I could feel the boundary between worlds beginning to solidify, the window of opportunity slowly closing. The speaker approached our small group of humans, his massive form radiating a mixture of ancient wisdom and urgent concern. When he projected his thoughts, they carried the weight of geological time and the immediacy of a ticking clock. The turning approaches. Those who remain must take their place in the greater working. Those who return must carry the burden of knowledge back to their world. Sarah Mitchell stood first, her transformation complete enough that she seemed to glow with inner light. I'm staying, she said simply. My work in marketing was about selling people things they didn't need. Here I can help preserve something they can't live without, whether they know it or not. Her husband David nodded slowly. We've talked about it. Our old life. It feels like sleepwalking now. How do you go back to worrying about mortgage payments when you've seen the machinery that keeps reality functioning? Tom Walsh struggled more visibly with the choice. My kids, he said. How do... I explained to a 10-year-old and a 7-year-old that Daddy isn't coming home because he's fighting interdimensional entities to keep their world from collapsing. Children adapt more easily than adults to new realities, the speaker projected. They have not yet learned to deny what their senses tell them. Your offspring will understand in time that their father chose to protect, rather than abandon them. Jennifer Walsh took her husband's hand. Tom, remember what we felt when we first crossed over? That sense of finally finding where we belonged? Can we really turn our backs on that? I watched their struggle, understanding it all too well. The rational part of my mind cataloged all the reasons to return. My job, my responsibilities, the search and rescue operation that was probably expanding by the hour. But the deeper part of me, the part that carried my great-grandmother's stories and the weight of an ancient name, recognized that I'd been preparing for this choice my entire life. The transformed physicist approached us again, her enhanced senses reading the emotional resonance around our group. The hardest part, she said, isn't making the choice. It's living with the knowledge of what you've left behind. But you have to understand. The work we do here touches every life in your world. Every person who goes to sleep safely at night owes their peace to guardians they'll never know existed. My radio crackled one final time. Kane, we need your status. The media's starting to pick up on 4 missing hikers plus a forest ranger. This is becoming a situation. I looked at the device in my hand. A piece of technology that could somehow breach dimensional barriers but couldn't begin to convey the reality of what I'd discovered. The normal world was calling, demanding explanations that couldn't be given, solutions that wouldn't be understood. Sarah, David, I said, turning to the first couple. You're certain about staying? As certain as we've ever been about anything, Sarah replied. We can do more good here than we ever could in Atlanta. Tom and Jennifer exchanged a long look, communicating in the way that only couples who've shared decades together can manage. Finally, Tom spoke. We're staying too. Our kids. They'll be safer with us working to protect the boundaries than they would be with us back home pretending none of this exists. I nodded, understanding their choice even as it complicated mine. As the only law enforcement officer in the group, I would be the one expected to provide explanations, to file reports, to account for what had happened to 4 civilians under my watch. And your choice, guardian of the hunt? The speaker inquired. I touched the medicine pouch at my belt, feeling the sacred items my great-grandmother had given me. In this place where intention shaped reality, they pulsed with power that had been waiting decades to be fully awakened. I need to return. I said, the words feeling like they were being torn from my soul. Someone has to maintain the boundary from the other side. Someone has to prepare the way for others who carry the old blood. Help them find their way to places like this when they're needed. The speaker's emotional resonance shifted to what I could only interpret as approval mixed with sorrow. The hardest path, but perhaps the most necessary. Your world will have great need of guardians in the time to come. What do I tell them? I asked. About the missing hikers? Tell them the truth, he replied. As much truth as they can accept. Missing persons who were found safe but chose not to return to their old lives. It happens more often than your authorities admit. The transformed physicist handed me something. A small crystal that seemed to contain its own aurora, swirling with colors that shifted based on the angle of view. A communication device, she explained. It will allow limited contact between dimensions. Use it wisely. Sarah approached and embraced me, her transformed nature allowing her to project her thoughts directly. You're not abandoning us. You're making sure others can find their way here when the time comes. I felt the boundary beginning to solidify, the window between worlds preparing to close. The 4 hikers moved toward the deeper parts of the archive, where other transformed. Humans were learning to interface with technologies that transcended anything our world had developed. Go now, the speaker projected. The path will remain open for you alone until the next turning. When your world has greater need, you will be called to return. I walked back through the twisted forest, past the crystalline city, toward the shimmering gap between dimensions. With each step I felt the weight of normal reality pulling at me, the laws of physics reasserting themselves, the comfortable limitations of single-world existence beckoning like a warm bed on a cold morning. But I also felt something else, the steady pulse of the crystal in my pocket, the knowledge that I now carried information that could save both worlds, and the deep satisfaction that comes from finally understanding one's true purpose. The boundary loomed before me, a doorway of coruscating energy that led back to a reality that would seem impossibly small after what I'd experienced. I stepped through, feeling the universe reorganize itself around me, and found myself back in the stone circle under the blood moon. My radio immediately came alive with voices. Kane, respond. We have your location. We're coming to you. Looked around the hollow, empty now except for the ancient stones and the oak tree whose branches no longer held torn clothing. In this reality, the hikers had simply vanished, leaving no trace except the footprints that led to nowhere. But in my pocket, the crystal pulsed with alien warmth, and in my memory, 4 brave souls were beginning new lives as bridges between worlds. I keyed the radio. This is Ranger Kane. I'm at the stone circle in Devil's Hollow. The missing hikers. I paused, choosing my words carefully. They're safe, but they won't be coming back. What do you mean they won't be coming back? I looked up at the blood moon, now fading as dawn approached the normal world. In a few hours, I would file the most unusual report of my career. In the weeks to come, I would face questions I couldn't fully answer and investigations I couldn't completely satisfy. But I would also begin the real work, identifying others who carried the old blood, preparing them for the choice they would eventually face, and maintaining the ancient compact that kept two worlds from destroying each other. I said into the radio, that sometimes people find something worth more than the life they left behind. As the backup team's voices grew closer through the forest, I touched the crystal in my pocket and felt the distant presence of the four guardians who had made their choice. The boundary was secure, the compact endured. And somewhere in the files of missing persons cases across the country, other potential guardians waited to be awakened to their true purpose. My name is Michael Kane, but the Cherokee side of my family calls me Kanati, guardian of the hunt, and I finally understand what I'm hunting for. My name is Kanati Nightwalker, and I am the last of my bloodline to carry the old knowledge. The name was given to me by my great-grandmother when I turned 16, replacing the simple Kevin I'd carried since birth. In Cherokee tradition, Kanati means the first man and guardian of the hunt, and she said the spirits had whispered to her that I would need this ancient strength for what was coming. 7 years I've walked these trails as a park ranger in the Nantahala National Forest, but the mountains have known my family for 7 generations. My ancestors called this place Enviguana, the healing place where the earth spirits dwell strongest. Every morning when I lace up my boots, I whisper the old prayer my great-grandmother taught me. Spirits of the 7 sacred directions, guide my steps and sharpen my sight. The forest had been restless for weeks. Not the normal sounds of wildlife adjusting to autumn's approach, but something deeper, an ancient stirring that made the hair on my neck stand like hackles. 3 hikers had gone missing in the past month, all experienced outdoors people who knew these trails better than the veins in their own hands. Search and rescue found no trace, no clothing scraps, no disturbed ground, no blood. They simply vanished as if the earth had swallowed them whole. It was Tuesday morning, October 15th, when the call came through my radio. My coffee was still steaming in the cup when dispatch crackled to life. Ranger Nightwalker, we've got a concerned parent. Family of 4 hikers overdue from the Chunky Gal Trail. Last contact was yesterday at 1400 hours. The Chunky Gal Trail. My pulse quickened. That was where the others had disappeared, deep in the old-growth forest where the trees grew so thick that noon looked like twilight. The Cherokee elders called it Kituunvi, the place where the spirit world touches ours. I grabbed my pack, checking the contents by instinct. First aid kit, emergency rations, GPS device, flares, and the .40 caliber service weapon I hoped never to use. From my personal kit, I added something dispatch didn't know about. A small medicine pouch my great-grandmother had sewn, filled with tobacco and sage blessed by 7 Cherokee grandmothers. In our tradition, tobacco is sacred, a gift that opens communication between the world of the living and the world of spirits. The drive to the trailhead took 40 minutes through winding mountain roads. October in these mountains painted the world in fierce reds and golds, but today the colors seemed muted, as if a shadow lay across the land. The temperature had dropped 15 degrees overnight, and my breath formed small clouds in the early morning air. At the trailhead I found their vehicle, a white Subaru Forester with Colorado plates and hiking stickers covering the back window. The doors were unlocked, which wasn't unusual for experienced hikers, but something felt wrong. I approached with the caution my grandfather had taught me when tracking deer. Move like the shadow of a cloud and listen with more than your ears. Inside the car, everything was normal. Trail maps, water bottles, energy bars, a child's coloring. Book lay open on the back seat, a princess and a dragon locked in eternal battle. The image made me uneasy, though I couldn't say why. I shouldered my pack and started up the trail, following the worn path into the heart of the forest. The Chunky Gal Trail wound through some of the oldest trees in these mountains, massive, hemlocks and white oaks that had been ancient when my ancestors first walked these ridges. But as I climbed higher, the normal sounds of the forest grew muted. No bird calls, no scurrying of squirrels. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. In Cherokee tradition, when the forest falls this silent, it means the animals are hiding from something that doesn't belong. 2 miles up the trail, I found their first marker, a red bandana tied to a tree branch, exactly as experienced hikers would do, but the knot was wrong. Too tight, too deliberate, as if something had pulled it with immense strength. The bark around the tie point was scarred with deep gouges that looked like claw marks, but they were too large, too deep, to be from any known animal in these mountains. I knelt beside the tree and touched the scars in the bark. They were fresh, maybe 6 hours old. Whatever had made them possessed tremendous strength. A bear could leave marks like these, but not at this height. The gouges started 8 feet from the ground and extended upward. My great-grandmother's voice echoed in my memory. When the forest grows quiet and the earth shows wounds, that's when Invia walks among us. Envia, the ancient word for the thing that should not be. I'd heard the stories since childhood, dismissed them as folklore meant to keep children from wandering too deep into the wilderness. But standing there in that unnatural silence, with those impossible marks scoring the ancient bark, I began to understand that some stories are warnings. I pressed deeper into the forest, following the trail and the occasional marker left by the missing family. The path grew steeper and the trees more dense, filtering the autumn light into a perpetual green twilight. At the 3-mile mark, I should have reached Chunky Gal Falls, where the family would likely have stopped for lunch and photographs. Instead, I found something that made my blood run cold. The trees formed a perfect circle around a small clearing, as if they'd been planted that way, though I knew these oaks and hemlocks were centuries old. In the center of the circle, 4 backpacks sat in a neat row, untouched by animals or weather. No sign of struggle, no bodies, just 4 packs arranged with military precision in a place where the very air seemed to hum with wrongness. I approached cautiously, every instinct screaming danger. The silence was complete now, not even the whisper of wind through leaves. It felt like walking into a cathedral where something dark was worshipped. As I reached for the first backpack, a sound split the silence that I'll never forget. A howl that began deep and guttural, like the cry of a wounded bear, then rose in pitch until it became something almost human. It echoed off the mountains for what seemed like minutes, a sound that spoke of intelligence and fury and a hunger I couldn't comprehend. The howl came from above me. I looked up into the canopy of ancient trees, and something looked back. What I saw in those branches defied every rational thought in my mind. A massive form crouched on a limb that should have snapped under the weight of anything larger than a raccoon. It was easily 8 feet tall, covered in dark hair that seemed to absorb the filtered sunlight. But it was the eyes that froze my blood, intelligent, calculating, and filled with an ancient malevolence that spoke of countless years watching from the shadows. For a heartbeat that lasted forever, we stared at each other. The creature's face was a nightmare amalgamation of human and beast, distinctly primate features but with a wisdom behind those dark eyes that was disturbingly human. Its massive hands gripped the tree limb with fingers that were too long, too thick, ending in nails that looked more like talons. Then it moved. I'd spent 7 years in these mountains, tracking animals and learning their behaviors. But nothing had prepared me for the fluid grace of this creature. It didn't climb down the tree. It flowed from branch to branch like water finding its level, moving with a silence that should have been impossible for something that size. Within seconds, it had descended to ground level and disappeared into the underbrush without so much as a rustled leaf to mark its passage. My hand had instinctively gone to my weapon, but I hadn't drawn it. Some primal part of my brain, the part that still carried the wisdom of my Cherokee ancestors, knew that showing aggression to this thing would be suicide. Instead, I reached into my shirt and gripped the medicine pouch my great-grandmother had given me, whispering a prayer in the old language. Uzdiduyuktuv, galunlati naskine. Great Spirit, protect me from evil. The backpacks still sat in their perfect row, but now I understood they weren't abandoned equipment. They were bait. Or perhaps trophies. Whatever that creature was, it had intelligence enough for strategy, for planning. It had arranged those packs deliberately, knowing someone would come looking for the missing family. I keyed my radio with shaking hands. "Dispatch, this is Ranger Nightwalker. I've located the missing hikers' equipment at Chunky Gal Falls area. No sign of the hikers themselves. Requesting immediate backup and search and rescue deployment." Static answered me. I tried again, adjusting the frequency and checking my position on the GPS. The coordinates showed me exactly where I should be, but the radio remained silent. Looking at the device, I saw the signal strength was 0. Impossible in this area where I'd always had clear communication with base. A branch snapped somewhere in the forest behind me. I turned slowly, my hand now resting on the grip of my service weapon. Cherokee tradition teaches that there are 7 sacred directions: north, south, east, west, above, below, and center. Right now, I felt threatened from all 7. "Hello?" I called out, my voice swallowed by the oppressive silence of the forest. "This is Park Ranger Nightwalker. If anyone can hear me, please respond." The answer came not in words but in a sound that will haunt me until my dying day. It started as a low rumble, like distant thunder, but gradually formed into something that approximated human speech, if humans could speak with vocal cords the size of tree trunks. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, vibrating through the forest floor and into my bones. "Wohali, Wohali Tsehi." My blood turned to ice. The words were Cherokee. Eagle, eagle sees. But the pronunciation was wrong, distorted, as if something was speaking my ancestral language with a mouth not designed for human speech. My great-grandmother had told me stories of the old days, when the Cherokee believed certain creatures could mimic human language to lure people deeper into the wilderness. Another sound reached me then. Human voices, faint but distinct, coming from somewhere deeper in the forest. A woman calling for help, children crying, the missing family. Every rational part of my mind screamed that this was a trap, that whatever was out there was using the voices of its victims to draw me in. But I'd sworn an oath to protect the people who came to these mountains, and the sound of those children crying cut through my fear like a knife through paper. I began moving toward the voices, following what appeared to be a game trail that wound through the densest part of the forest. The backpacks remained behind me, silent witnesses to whatever horror had claimed their owners. With each step, the canopy overhead grew thicker, until walking felt like descending into a green cave. The voices grew louder. I could make out words now. A woman sobbing, "Please, we have children," and a man's voice, weak and desperate, "Help us, someone please help us." But there was something wrong with the acoustics. The voices seemed to come from multiple directions at once, as if they were being projected, reflected off the trees in impossible ways. And underneath the human sounds I could hear something else. A low rhythmic sound like breathing, but far too deep and slow to be human. The trail led to a natural depression in the forest floor, a bowl-shaped area surrounded by massive boulders that must have fallen from the cliffs above centuries ago. The depression was easily 50 feet across and 20 feet deep, with steep sides that would make climbing out difficult even for someone in good health. At the bottom of the depression, I saw them. 4 figures huddled together near the center of the bowl, 2 adults and 2 children, exactly matching the description of the missing family. They appeared to be alive but in distress, moving weakly and calling for help. Relief flooded through me. I'd found them. They were alive. But as I started down the slope toward them, every instinct screamed danger. The Cherokee have a word. Adawehi for the feeling when the spirits are trying to warn you of immediate peril. It was the same feeling my grandfather described when he nearly walked into a brown bear den, the same warning my great-grandmother felt moments before a copperhead struck at her feet. I stopped halfway down the slope and studied the scene more carefully. The family was positioned too perfectly, too neatly arranged. And their movements? They moved in unison, subtle, synchronized swaying like marionettes controlled by the same puppeteer. Then I noticed their faces. From this distance, in the dim light filtering through the canopy, I couldn't make out distinct features, but there was something profoundly wrong with the proportions. The heads were too large, the limbs too long, and their eyes reflected light like an animal's. The voices continued calling for help, but now I could hear that they were coming from somewhere above the figures, not from the figures themselves. As I watched in growing horror, I realized what I was seeing weren't the missing hikers at all. They were decoys. Whatever intelligence controlled this creature, it was far more sophisticated than I'd imagined. It had created lures that could fool the human eye at distance, using them to draw searchers into a carefully prepared trap. The depression would be impossible to escape quickly, and anything that ventured to the bottom would be completely vulnerable. The real voices, the crying, the pleas for help, were coming from somewhere else entirely. Somewhere deeper in the forest, where the actual family was being held, or worse. I began backing up the slope, moving as quietly as possible, but the loose soil betrayed me. A small avalanche of dirt and stones rattled down into the bowl, and the four figures instantly snapped to attention, turning toward me with movements too fast and too coordinated to be human. That's when I saw their true faces, and understood why the Cherokee have words for things that should not exist. The howl that erupted from the forest around me was answered by three others, coming from different directions. I was surrounded. I ran. 7 years of ranger training, a lifetime of Cherokee wisdom about moving through the forest, and the pure adrenaline of terror combined into something approaching flight. I crashed through the underbrush, abandoning all attempts at stealth, focused solely on reaching open ground where I might have a chance. Behind me, the forest exploded into motion. Trees shook as massive forms moved through the canopy above, keeping pace with my desperate flight. The sounds they made were no longer attempting to mimic human speech. They were communication, a coordination between predators that spoke of intelligence and pack behavior. My grandfather had taught me that when you're being hunted, don't run, straight. The prey that runs in lines dies quickly, he'd said. The prey that thinks like water lives to see another sunrise. I began zigzagging through the trees, using fallen logs and boulders as cover, changing direction every few seconds. The strategy might have worked against normal predators, but these were not normal creatures. They anticipated my movements, cutting me off from the main trail, herding me deeper into the old-growth forest where the trees grew so thick that the ground was carpeted in perpetual shadow. I reached for my radio again, desperately trying different frequencies, but the static had been replaced by something worse, a low rhythmic sound like breathing, as if something was listening on every channel. My GPS showed my position, but the satellite signal was weak and intermittent. A massive tree trunk crashed to the ground 20 feet ahead of me, thrown with such force that it embedded itself 3 feet into the earth. I skidded to a halt, realizing I'd been herded into another trap. The fallen tree blocked my path forward, and when I turned to retreat, 3 of them stepped out of the shadows behind me. Up close, in what little light filtered through the canopy, I got my first clear look at what we were truly dealing with. They stood upright like men, but were built like the nightmares of giants. 8 to 9 feet tall, covered in dark hair that seemed to move with a life of its own. Their faces were a disturbing hybrid of human and primate features, with intelligence burning in their dark eyes that was both ancient and utterly alien. But it was their hands that held my attention. Those massive clawed appendages were stained dark with something I didn't want to identify, and they held objects that made my blood freeze: pieces of clothing, a child's shoe, a wedding ring still attached to a severed finger. The largest of the 3, the one I'd first seen in the canopy, stepped forward and spoke in that distorted approximation of Cherokee. "Kanati, Envia Osiu, Kanati. You see us." It knew my name. Not just my name, but my Cherokee name, the one given to me by the spirits through my great-grandmother. This thing had been watching me, studying me perhaps for years. I drew my service weapon, knowing it was futile but unable to simply stand there and die. "Where is the family?" I demanded, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. "Where are the hikers?" The creature tilted its massive head, studying me with those unsettling, intelligent eyes. When it spoke again, the words were clearer, as if it was learning to form human speech even as we talked. They feed the old hunger, as will you, the old hunger. My great-grandmother's stories came flooding back, tales of the time before time, when the Cherokee first came to these mountains and found them inhabited by things that existed before humans walked the earth, creatures that had agreed to stay hidden in exchange for tribute. Enviakanigv, I whispered, the ancient Cherokee phrase for the Old Covenant. The agreement our people made with your kind. The creature's expression shifted, showing what might have been surprise. It spoke to its companions in a language that was not quite sound, not quite vibration, but something felt in the bones. They responded in kind, and I had the distinct impression they were debating something. Finally, it turned back to me. You. Knowing the old words, your blood carries memory. My great-grandmother told me the stories, I said, keeping the gun raised but not directly threatening. She said there was a covenant between our peoples. The Cherokee would leave offerings in the sacred places, and your kind would remain hidden from the outside world. Offerings stopped. Your people forgot, brought strangers to our mountains. The creature's voice was growing more articulate with each word, as if millennia of disuse were being swept away. We hunger. We take what is owed. I thought of the missing hikers, the perfect arrangement of their backpacks, the systematic way these disappearances had been occurring. The Cherokee had once left food and tobacco at specific sacred sites throughout these mountains, a practice that had died out with my great-grandmother's generation. Without those offerings, these ancient entities had begun taking what they needed to survive. I can restore the covenant, I said, the words coming from some deep well of ancestral memory. I carry the old blood. I speak the old tongue. I can make the offerings as my people once did. The three creatures communicated again in their bone-deep language. The largest studied me for a long moment, then spoke. Prove your words. Make offering now. With hands that shook only slightly, I reached into my shirt and withdrew my great-grandmother's medicine pouch. I opened it and began sprinkling the blessed tobacco on the ground between us, speaking the prayer she had taught me for honoring the spirits of the deep forest. Galun lati usdi, higa galvquadiyu, ale gesdi ale nvgi gesundale, envhi amayeliyu, doyu, ale invia gesundale doyu. Great Spirit above, I offer you tobacco and sage and sacred smoke. May the land be at peace, and may all beings find harmony. The effect was immediate and profound. The three creatures stepped back, and their aggressive postures shifted to something approaching respect. The largest nodded slowly, then spoke in Cherokee that was suddenly clear and fluent. Us dinvdo kanegv. Nvhi amayeliyu. It is the old covenant, the land remembers. Where is the family? I asked again, this time with the authority of one who speaks for his people. The creature gestured toward the deeper forest. Alive, held, for the ceremony. We meant to honor them, as your people once honored us, with proper death. My stomach clenched. Take me to them. The journey deeper into the forest revealed the true extent of what I was dealing with. The creatures moved through the trees with impossible grace, and I realized this was just the beginning. There were more of them, many more, watching from the shadows. An entire community that had existed in these mountains since before human memory. We reached a natural amphitheater carved into the mountainside, hidden so deep in the old-growth forest that satellite images would never detect it. At the center, carved from living rock, stood a massive stone altar stained dark with centuries of use. And around the altar, bound with ropes that looked to be woven from vines and sinew, were the four missing hikers. They were alive, though unconscious, probably drugged with some natural substance. The two children, a girl of maybe 10 and a boy of 7, were curled together near their parents. All four looked unharmed but pale, as if they'd been drained of something vital. The old ceremony requires willing sacrifice, or covenant. Keeper's choice, the creature explained. You speak for your people, choose. I looked at the family, then at the dozens of glowing eyes watching from the darkness around the amphitheater. My great-grandmother's words echoed in my memory. Sometimes the greatest courage is knowing when to honor the old ways, and when to forge new ones. I offer myself, I said, surprising everyone present, including myself. Take me instead of them. Let them go, and I'll stay. I'll restore the covenant properly, ensure regular offerings, and serve as liaison between our peoples. The creature studied me for a long moment. Kanatin via osi, envi amayeli doyu. Kanati who sees the hidden ones. The land will know peace. What happened next was negotiation unlike anything in human experience. These ancient beings explained their needs, their hunger, not just for physical sustenance, but for recognition, for respect, for the acknowledgement that they were the original inhabitants of these mountains. In return, they would return to the old agreement, remaining hidden from the outside world in exchange for regular offerings and the understanding that certain places would remain sacred and undisturbed. I agreed to serve as the keeper of the covenant, the one who would ensure the old obligations were met. In return, the family would be released with no memory of their capture, believing they had simply gotten lost and been found by a search and rescue team. As dawn broke over the mountains, I watched the family being led away by creatures who moved like shadows. They would wake up near their car, confused but unharmed, with a story of getting turned around on the trail and spending a cold night in the forest before finding their way out. I remained in the amphitheater, where I spent 3 days learning the true history of these mountains, the extent of the ancient covenant, and my responsibilities as its keeper. When I finally emerged and returned to my ranger duties, I carried knowledge that would have driven most people mad. Now, every 7th day, I come to the old sacred places and leave offerings of tobacco and sage, food, and respect. The disappearances have stopped. The forest has returned to its natural rhythms. And when hikers ask me about the strange sounds they sometimes hear in the deep woods, I tell them what my great-grandmother would have said. Some things in these mountains are older than memory, and it's best to show them respect. The covenant holds as it has for 7 generations of my family, as it will for 7 generations more. And in the deepest parts of the Nantahala National Forest, where the trees grow thick enough to hide entire worlds, the ancient ones keep their part of the bargain. They remain hidden and the mountains know peace. But sometimes late at night when I'm alone on patrol, I hear their voices calling my name from the darkness between the trees. Not in threat, but in greeting, one guardian to another, watching over these ancient mountains together. Kanati Envia Osi. Kanati who sees the hidden ones, and I do see them. Every day, guardians of a forest that holds secrets older than civilization, keepers of a covenant that binds 2 worlds in fragile harmony. The tourists and day hikers will never know how close they come to stepping into legend, how thin the veil is between the world they know and the world that watches them from the shadows. But I know. And I keep the promise my great-grandmother made me swear, to honor the old ways, to respect the ancient places, and to remember that some stories are not meant to entertain, they are meant to keep us alive. The limestone mountains of Picos de Europa breathed with an ancient rhythm that morning, exhaling mist from their countless hidden mouths. These peaks contained some of the deepest cave systems found in Europe, where the greatest volume of water, channeled underground through limestone passages carved over millions of years. Eloy Campilio Perez stood at the edge of Sotris watching the fog roll between the jagged peaks and felt something shift in the mountain's depths, a subtle tremor that spoke of hunger. At 31, Eloy had learned to read the mountain's moods. As forest ranger, he knew every trail, every hidden cave where the famous blue cheese aged in darkness. As mayor, he knew every secret his people carried. But lately, the mountain seemed different. The limestone caves that honeycombed the peaks had always whispered, water dripping through endless passages, air moving through chambers no man had ever seen. Now those whispers carried a different tone. The Spanish Civil War had ended 6 years ago, but its ghosts still wandered these heights. General Franco's fascist victory had driven Republican fighters into the wild places, and the Picos de Europa had swallowed them whole. Some said 30,000 men had vanished into Spain's mountains. Eloy wondered how many had found their way into the deep places, into caves that descended over 1,000 meters into the earth's bowels. Walking the familiar path to his ranger station, Eloy passed the entrance to one of the cheese caves. The opening was modest, just large enough for a man to squeeze through with a wheel of cabrales strapped to his back. But Eloy knew these caves connected to vast networks that stretched for kilometers underground. Local cheesemakers had to hike for hours to reach some of the deeper caves, carrying their precious cargo on foot or horseback to wooden shelves deep inside, where the cheese would age for months in complete darkness. The war had changed everything about these mountains. Where once shepherds had moved freely between the peaks with their flocks, now every shadow might conceal a guerrilla fighter or a civil guard patrol. The ancient caves that had sheltered shepherds during storms now harbored men with guns and grievances that ran deeper than the limestone passages themselves. Eloy's morning routine felt different today. The birds seemed quieter. Even the ever-present sound of water moving through stone, the mountain's circulatory system, carried an undertone that made his skin crawl. When he reached his station, a note waited for him. The handwriting belonged to Alfonso Martinez, his fellow ranger and friend since childhood. Need to talk. Important information about the resistance. Meet me at the old oak grove after dark. Eloy's hands trembled as he read. Alfonso had always been cautious to the point of paranoia since the war ended. If he was requesting a meeting about the guerrillas, something significant had happened. That evening, fog thick as wool blanketed the mountainside. Eloy made his way to the oak grove, ancient trees that had stood when the Romans first glimpsed these peaks. The limestone beneath his feet was treacherous in the mist, sharp runnels and grikes carved by acidic rain, creating the perfect niches for mountain plants but dangerous footing for men. Alfonso emerged from the fog like a specter, his face pale and drawn. Eloy, thank God you came. I've been wrestling with this for days. What's happened? The Civil Guard approached me last week. They know about the resistance activities in our sector. They know Juan Fernandez Ayala is operating from the high caves. Eloy felt his blood chill. Juan had been his closest friend before the war. Brilliant, passionate, convinced that Spanish fascism could be defeated if the resistance remained strong enough long enough. If Franco's forces had located Juan's hideout, they want information, Alfonso continued. Specific locations, meeting times. They've promised protection for our families if we cooperate. And if we don't? Alfonso's silence answered that question. The fog seemed to press closer, and somewhere in the distance Eloy heard a sound that made his bones ache. A low moaning that might have been wind through cave openings, but carried notes of something far more unsettling. In these mountains, the caves were known for their sounds, air moving through passages creating mournful wailing that had inspired local legends about supernatural creatures dwelling in the depths. I haven't given them anything yet, Alfonso whispered. But they're coming back tomorrow. They want locations of the guerrilla camps, and they specifically mentioned Juan. You know I can't ask you to risk your family. And I can't ask you to risk yours. But Eloy, there's something else. Something the guard captain said. He claimed they already have sources inside the resistance. Someone close to Juan has been feeding them information. The moaning sound from the caves grew louder, joined by others. A chorus of wind through limestone passages that sounded almost like voices calling from the deep places. Eloy had heard similar sounds his entire life, but tonight they seemed to carry words. Come down. Come deep. Feed the darkness. He shook his head, trying to clear it. We need to warn Juan. How? You know he won't trust any message that comes through normal channels now. And if there really is an informant... Another sound joined the cave song. A rhythmic knocking, like hammers against stone, echoing from multiple directions. Local legends. spoke of creatures called Tommyknockers that lived in caves and mines, whose knocking either warned of danger or caused cave-ins, depending on whether they were benevolent spirits or malevolent ones. I'll have to meet with him directly, Eloy decided. Face to face, he'll listen to me. That's suicide. If you're seen with him, if you're caught, then I'll be careful. But as they parted ways that night, both men felt eyes watching from the darkness. The limestone caves around Sotras had witnessed countless secrets over the millennia. Now they were about to witness another tragedy, one that would echo through their passages for 73 years. In the deepest cave beneath the mountain, a shaft called Torca de Topinoria that plunged nearly 200 meters straight down, something stirred in response to the approaching betrayal. The limestone walls, carved by millions of years of patient water, began to weep in anticipation. April 15th, 1945. The abandoned villa sat like a wound in the forest, its stone walls crumbling back into the earth from which they'd been quarried. Wild roses had conquered the courtyard, their thorns thick as barbed wire. Eloy approached through morning mist that clung to the peaks like funeral shrouds, each step on the limestone path echoing with ominous resonance. Juan Fernandez Ayala waited inside, flanked by 4 of his most trusted fighters. At 27, Juan had aged decades in the 6 years since the war's official end. His eyes held the hollow gleam of a man who'd seen too much death, lived too long in darkness. The guerrilla leader embraced his old friend, but Eloy felt tension in the gesture, the careful wariness of someone who'd learned that betrayal could come from anywhere. You took a risk coming here, Juan said. We both did. But this couldn't wait. The villa's walls seemed to lean inward as Eloy explained Alfonso's revelation. Ancient mortar crumbled at their voices, dust motes dancing in shafts of sunlight that pierced the rotting roof. Outside, the sound of dripping water from the caves seemed to grow more insistent, as if the mountain itself was listening. Juan's men, Stephen, a former schoolteacher, Gary, who'd lost his entire family to Franco's purges, Dennis, barely 18 but already a veteran of a dozen ambushes, listened with faces carved from stone. They'd survived by trusting no one completely, and now even that fragile trust was dissolving. Alfonso could be lying, Stephen suggested, testing your loyalty. Or the guards could be feeding him false information, Gary added, making him think there's an informant when there isn't. But Juan shook his head. There have been signs, patrols appearing where they shouldn't know to look, supply drops intercepted. Someone has been talking. The dripping sound from outside intensified, joined by what sounded like whispered conversations. The mountain's underground rivers carrying sounds through passages that connected cave to cave across kilometers of limestone. These cave systems formed a vast underground network where water dissolved calcium carbonate and entered the subsoil through sinkholes, creating rivers that found deeper spaces, abandoning their former courses to carve galleries and wells, sometimes hundreds of meters deep. There's something else, Eloy said reluctantly. The guard specifically mentioned you by name, Juan. They know about your operations here. Dennis moved to the window, hand on his pistol. Could be anyone. Shepherds see our camps, travelers. Spot our supply routes? No. Juan's voice carried absolute certainty. It's someone inside. Someone who knows our plans before we execute them. Through the villa's broken windows, the morning mist began to clear, revealing the limestone landscape beyond. A terrain so riddled with caves and fissures that entire armies could vanish without trace. Sharp potholes called juice dotted the teal surface, making the area notorious for the dangers faced by walkers and mountaineers. Local legends claimed these holes were mouths of sleeping giants, ready to swallow the unwary. That's when they heard the footsteps. The sound came from multiple directions. Boots on stone, the careful tread of men moving through treacherous terrain. Juan's fighters had chosen this villa specifically because it could be easily defended, with clear sight lines and multiple escape routes. But now those advantages seemed meaningless. How many? Gary whispered, checking his rifle. Dennis peered, through a crack in the wall. At least a dozen, maybe more in the tree line. The civil guard had come in force, but they'd made one crucial error. They'd announced their presence too early, allowing the guerrillas time to prepare. Juan smiled grimly. They want us alive. Otherwise, they would have just opened fire. What do we do? We remind them why the Picos de Europa swallowed 30,000 of Franco's best men. The battle that followed would be remembered in local folklore for generations, though the official records would omit crucial details. The guerrillas knew every limestone ledge, every hidden approach, every cave entrance that could serve as escape route or ambush point. They turned the broken villa into a fortress, using the rubble and thorn-covered walls to create perfect firing positions. When the first civil guard assault came, 2 fascist soldiers fell immediately to perfectly placed shots from Stephen and Dennis. The others took cover behind the stone walls of the courtyard. But the guerrillas had anticipated this. Juan had cached weapons and ammunition in multiple positions during previous months, turning the entire area into a killing field. The battle raged for 3 hours, gunfire echoing off limestone cliffs and disappearing into cave mouths that seemed to swallow sound itself. The fascists had superior numbers, but the guerrillas had intimate knowledge of terrain that had been carved by millions of years of patient water, creating a landscape of sharp edges and hidden depths. But as the morning wore on, the sounds of battle began to change. The echoes from the gunfire started returning differently, as if the cave systems beneath them were amplifying and distorting each shot. Some of the soldiers reported hearing their own voices calling back to them from the depths, urging them deeper into the mountain. When the civil guard finally retreated to regroup, they left behind more than just their dead. They left behind men who seemed to have simply vanished, not killed, not wounded, just gone. Searchers would find their equipment scattered near cave entrances, but the men themselves had been swallowed by limestone passages that descended into absolute darkness. Juan and his fighters used the lull to gather what they could from the bodies of the fallen fascists. Among the dead was a civil guard captain whose uniform jacket contained a folded paper, their operational orders complete with intelligence about guerrilla activities and the name of their informant, Alfonso Martinez. "I'm sorry, old friend," Juan said when Eloy read the name. "But you know what this means." Eloy nodded, understanding that their childhood friendship was about to end in blood. The mountain's whispered voices seemed to grow louder, as if sensing approaching death. That evening, as the survivors made their way back to their hidden camps through passages that had been carved by ancient glaciers and patient water, they heard new sounds from the deepest caves. Not the familiar drip of condensation or the whistle of air through passages, but something that sounded almost like weeping. The Torca de Topinoria had been carved over millions of years by water-seeking, the path of least resistance through limestone, creating a shaft that plunged nearly 200 meters straight into the mountain's heart. Local shepherds avoided the area, claiming the cave entrance breathed with malevolent intent. Tonight, it seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the sacrifice it knew was coming. April 24th, 1945. The summons came at dawn, a single knock on Eloy's door, followed by Juan's voice calling softly through the wood. When Eloy emerged, he found his childhood friend flanked by Stephen and Gary, their faces grim as granite. The morning mist clung to the peaks like shrouds, and somewhere in the distance, the caves were singing. "We need to talk," Juan said simply. They walked in silence through paths Eloy had known since childhood, limestone tracks carved by shepherds and their flocks over centuries. The familiar landmarks, the twisted oak struck by lightning, the spring where crystal-clear water emerged from the mountain's depths, seemed different now, touched by an atmosphere of impending doom. The water that flowed from these springs had traveled through vast underground networks, dissolving calcium carbonate and carving galleries that could extend for kilometers beneath the surface. Local folklore claimed these waters carried messages between the deep places, that the mountain itself could speak through the liquid voices of its hidden rivers. Today, those voices seemed to whisper of death. The guerrilla camp lay hidden in a valley accessible only through a narrow defile between towering limestone cliffs. Here, among caves that had sheltered Spanish shepherds for millennia, Juan's fighters had built their stronghold. Rough shelters clung to cave entrances, and supply caches were hidden in passages that extended deep into the mountain's core. But as they approached the camp, Eloy noticed something wrong. The usual sounds, men cleaning weapons, preparing food, the low murmur of conversation, were absent. The only sound came from the caves themselves, a rhythmic knocking that echoed from multiple directions, as if the mountain were trying to communicate in some primitive Morse code. Local legends spoke of Tommy knockers, supernatural creatures whose knocking either warned of danger or caused cave-ins. Today the knocking seemed to carry both meanings, warning and threat intertwined. Alfonso has been feeding information to the civil guard for months, Juan said without preamble. The attack on the villa, our lost supply drops, the patrols that knew exactly where to find us, all of it traces back to him. Eloy felt something cold settle in his stomach. You're certain? Stephen produced the captured documents from the civil guard captain. Page after page of intelligence reports, meeting locations, names of resistance fighters, all in Alfonso's careful handwriting. He's been documenting everything, Gary said bitterly. Our strength, our weapons, our plans. Franco's dogs know more about our operations than some of our own men. The knocking from the caves intensified, joined by a low moaning that seemed to emerge from the deepest passages. The moaning cavern's titular sound had served as a siren song for nearly 100 prehistoric people, whose remains were found at the bottom, having been tempted to their death by the mysterious sounds. What do you want from me? Eloy asked, though he already knew. Justice, Juan replied. The kind of justice these mountains understand. They walked deeper into the valley, past cave entrances that exhaled cold air carrying scents of limestone and ancient darkness. Some of these caves descended over 1,000 meters into the Earth's core, creating vertical worlds where sunlight had never penetrated and water carved impossible architectures of stone. At the valley's heart sat the entrance to Torca de Topanuria, a.d. limestone shaft that plunged nearly 200 meters straight down into absolute darkness. Local shepherds had always avoided the area, claiming the cave breathed with malevolent purpose. Children were warned never to approach the entrance, where loose stones might give way beneath unwary feet. Alfonso betrayed not just us, but every man who died fighting fascism, Juan continued. Every family destroyed by Franco's purges, every dream of a free Spain. The cave entrance seemed to exhale as they approached, releasing air that had circulated through passages carved over millions of years. The breath carried whispers, not quite words, but sounds that suggested meaning, as if the mountain itself were participating in their conversation. I understand your anger, Eloy said carefully, but Alfonso is still my friend. There might be explanations. Explanations? Stephen's voice cracked with fury. Men are dead because of his information. Our friends, our brothers, led into ambushes because Alfonso sold them for fascist silver. The limestone beneath their feet was treacherous here, riddled with fissures and hidden holes that could swallow a man without warning. The acidic rain had carved sharp runnels and grikes into the rock surface, creating perfect niches for alpine plants but dangerous footing for humans. As they talked, more sounds emerged from the cave system. Voices that might have been wind, through passages, or might have been something else entirely. The echoes seemed to carry words. Feed us. Feed the darkness. Give us what we hunger for. The mountain is calling for justice, Juan said, and Eloy wasn't sure if his friend was speaking metaphorically or if he'd begun to believe the local superstitions about these caves having consciousness and intent. That afternoon, they brought Alfonso to the valley. The ranger came willingly, believing he was meeting with Eloy to discuss their predicament. His face went pale when he saw Juan and the other guerrillas waiting, but he maintained his composure. I can explain everything, Alfonso began, but Juan cut him off. We found your reports, your handwriting, your signature on documents that led to the deaths of our comrades. Alfonso's composure cracked. You don't understand the pressure. They threatened my children, my wife. They promised protection if I cooperated, death if I didn't. What choice did I have? The same choice we all had, Stephen replied coldly. the choice between courage and cowardice. The argument that followed would echo in the memories of everyone present. Alfonso pleaded, explaining his terror for his family's safety, his desperation to find some middle ground between competing loyalties. Juan and his men remained unmoved, their faces carved from the same limestone that surrounded them. As the sun set behind the peaks, painting the limestone, cliffs blood red, the sounds from Torca de Topanoria grew louder. The moaning, the knocking, the whispered voices, all seemed to build toward some inevitable crescendo. "The mountain has heard everything," Juan said finally. "It knows about betrayal, it knows about justice, and it's hungry." What happened next would remain hidden in the depths of the cave for 73 years, but the limestone walls would remember every detail. They would preserve the sounds of that evening like some geological recording device, waiting for the right moment to play back the echoes of betrayal and revenge. The Torca de Topanoria opened its mouth wider, exhaling ancient air that carried the scent of deep places where water had carved cathedrals of stone in absolute darkness. Somewhere in those depths, something waited with patience older than human civilization, ready to add new voices to its eternal chorus. Summer 2018. Dr. Mercedes Campillo Perez, 75 and fierce as the mountain winds, stood at the entrance to Torca de Topanoria and felt her father's presence in the limestone air. The professional cavers hired by the Spanish government worked methodically around her, preparing their descent into nearly 200 meters of absolute darkness, but Mercedes barely noticed their activity. She was listening to older sounds, whispers that had echoed through these passages for over 7 decades. The search team had been exploring the deep cave systems of Picos de Europa for months as part of the government's initiative to recover remains from Spain's turbulent past. These mountains contained some of the deepest cave systems in Europe, with over 3,700 caves forming a vast underground network carved by millions of years of water dissolving limestone. Each cave was a potential tomb, a repository of secrets the mountain had swallowed and preserved. Dr. Fernando Rodriguez, the expedition leader, approached Mercedes with respectful caution. "Señora, we're ready to begin the descent. Are you certain you want to remain here during the excavation?" Mercedes looked into the cave entrance where mist seemed to breathe outward from depths that had never known sunlight. "I've been waiting 73 years for this moment. I'm not leaving now." The cave's mouth was larger than expected, carved by ancient processes that had shaped the entire Picos de Europa region. Glaciation and karstification over hundreds of millions of years had created this landscape, where water entered the subsoil through sinkholes and carved galleries and wells, sometimes hundreds of meters deep. The Torca de Topanoria was one of the deepest shafts in the region, its walls polished smooth by millennia of patient erosion. As the cavers prepared their equipment, Mercedes heard other sounds joining the familiar whisper of air through stone passages. Rhythmic knocking echoed from multiple directions, and she remembered childhood stories about supernatural creatures that lived in caves and mines. The Tommyknockers were said to knock either as warnings of danger or as harbingers of cave-ins, and their sounds often preceded discoveries of the dead. The descent began at dawn, 3 professional cavers disappearing into the shaft like offerings to some ancient deity. Their helmet lights created dancing shadows on the limestone walls, illuminating rock formations that had taken millions of years to form. Radio chatter from the descent team crackled with technical observations about the cave's structure, but Mercedes heard something else in the static, voices that might have been echoes or might have been something more. Deeper. "Find us. We've been waiting so long." The first set of remains appeared after 6 hours of careful excavation, bones embedded in mud and debris at the bottom of the shaft, mixed with fragments of cloth that had somehow survived decades in the cave's particular microclimate. When the cavers radioed their discovery, Mercedes felt her heart clench with a mixture of relief and grief. But as the excavation continued, the team made increasingly disturbing discoveries. The bones showed clear evidence of deliberate placement rather than accidental fall, arranged in a manner that suggested someone had climbed down to position the body with almost ritualistic care. More unsettling were the sounds that began emerging from deeper passages. The cave system extended far beyond the main shaft, connecting to networks that stretched for kilometers underground. From these hidden depths came new voices, not the familiar whispers of air through stone, but something that sounded almost like conversation. Dr. Rodriguez's voice crackled through the radio, tension evident despite his professional tone. Mercedes, we're finding evidence of multiple individuals. The remains are scattered throughout the chamber, but in patterns that suggest intentional arrangement. How many? Mercedes asked. A long pause. At least 2 distinct sets of remains. Possibly more in the deeper passages. As afternoon faded into evening, the team extracted bone fragments that DNA analysis would later confirm belonged to Eloy Campillo Perez. But they also found something that would transform the discovery from simple historical recovery to active murder investigation. The remains of a young girl, aged approximately 10 to 14, who had died sometime between 5 and 15 years after Eloy's execution. The girl's bones told a troubling story. Despite supposedly falling nearly 200 meters into a rocky cave floor, only her skull showed significant damage. Her femur and jaw were completely intact, as if someone had lowered her body into the depths rather than allowing her to fall. This anomaly suggested either an impossible physical scenario or something far more sinister. Murder followed by a ritualistic burial in the mountain's depths. Dr. Fernando Carulia, the renowned forensic anthropologist who had helped identify soldiers from the Falklands War, arrived the following week to examine the second set of remains. Her analysis only deepened the mystery. The girl's bone structure indicated a diet rich in low-fat animal proteins, rather than the corn-based diet typical of rural families, suggesting she came from the more populous coastal regions rather than the mountain villages. This child was not a local shepherd, Dr. Carulia announced. Her physical development, dental structure, and bone density all indicate she lived near the coast before coming to these mountains. But perhaps most disturbing were the DNA results that created a physical description of the unknown girl. 4'8", tall, with green eyes and dark brown hair. When this description was disseminated throughout Cantabria, no one came forward with information. It was as if the girl had existed only to disappear into the mountain's hunger. The evening after Dr. Carulia's announcement, Mercedes camped at the cave entrance despite her family's protests. At 75, she was determined to maintain vigil over her father's final resting place and the unknown child who had shared his dark tomb. That night, alone with the limestone walls and the whispered conversations of underground rivers, Mercedes heard sounds that would haunt her remaining years. From the deepest passages came voices. Not quite words, but sounds that carried meaning. They seemed to be calling to each other across the vast network of caves, sharing stories of those who had entered the darkness and never returned. Among those voices, she was certain she heard her father's, still trying to explain, still seeking forgiveness for choices made in impossible circumstances, and beneath it all a child's voice, speaking in a dialect she couldn't quite place, telling stories of a hidden community that had lived and died in the mountain's embrace without the outside world ever knowing they existed. The knocking sounds intensified throughout the night, echoing from caves and shafts throughout the surrounding peaks. The Picos de Europa contained over 400 kilometers of mapped cave passages, with new discoveries being made regularly by speleologists from around the world. Each of these caves seemed to be participating in some vast underground conversation, as if the mountain itself were processing the revelation of its long-held secrets. By morning, Mercedes had made a decision that would scandalize her remaining family, but somehow felt absolutely right. When the investigation concluded and her father's remains were returned for proper burial, she would ensure the unknown girl was buried beside him in Sotras's ancient cemetery. They've been together in the dark for so many years, she told the journalists who had gathered to report on the discovery. It wouldn't be right to separate them now, but that decision would prove to be only the beginning of the mountain's revelations. As investigators continued exploring the cave system, they began finding evidence of other disappearances. fragments of clothing, personal items, bones that suggested Torca de Topanoria had been feeding on human tragedy for far longer than anyone imagined. The limestone had been patient, preserving its secrets in chambers carved by millions of years of flowing water. Now, finally, it was ready to tell its stories. But with each revelation came new questions about what had really happened in those depths and whether some hungers could ever truly be satisfied. October 2018. The autumn mists clung to the Picos de Europa like funeral veils, and in the depths of Torca de Topanoria, something ancient stirred with satisfaction. The mountain had kept its secrets for 73 years, but now the limestone walls were ready to reveal truths that would reshape understanding of what had happened in those depths. Dr. Fernando Cerullia stood at the cave entrance reviewing forensic reports that defied conventional explanation. 3 months of investigation had uncovered not 2 sets of remains, but evidence of at least 7 individuals who had entered the cave system over several decades and never emerged. The pattern suggested something far more disturbing than isolated tragedies. "The cave has been collecting," she announced to the assembled investigators, her voice carrying undertones of unease. Each of these deaths shows similar characteristics, evidence of careful placement rather than accidental fall, positioning that suggests ritualistic behavior, and timing that coincides with periods of social upheaval in the region. The Spanish Civil Guard detective assigned to the case, Inspector Carlos Mendez, reviewed the timeline they had constructed. Eloy Campillo Perez in 1945. The unknown girl sometime between 1950 and 1960. An adult male in the 1970s whose dental work suggested he was from Northern Europe. 2 more individuals in the 1980s, during the height of political tensions in the Basque regions. And most recently, remains that dated to the early 1990s. 7 people over nearly 50 years, Inspector Mendez said, all found in the same cave system, all showing evidence of deliberate placement. This isn't coincidence. But it was the discovery in the deepest chambers that had truly shaken the investigation team. Beyond the main shaft, where passages narrowed to barely human-sized crawlways, the cavers had found a chamber that defied geological explanation. The walls were covered in symbols, not carved, but somehow formed by mineral deposits over decades, as if the limestone itself had been writing messages. The symbols told a story that connected all the victims across the decades, images of betrayal, of communities hiding from authorities, of children separated from families during times of war and persecution. And beneath it all, recurring motifs of a presence that demanded payment, sacrifice, appeasement for some ancient wrong. Dr. Rodriguez, the expedition leader, had spent weeks mapping the chamber before admitting defeat. The symbols appear to have formed naturally through mineral deposition, but the patterns are too complex, too narrative to be purely geological. It's as if the cave itself has been remembering. The breakthrough came when investigators realized the chamber's symbols weren't random ancient markings, but a record of the hidden community that had lived in these mountains during and after the Spanish Civil War. Following Franco's rise to power, many innocent Spaniards had simply disappeared, not all victims of fascist persecution and not all joining guerrilla movements, but some choosing to live off the grid in Spain's remote, mine-riddled mountains. These invisible people had built ramshackle housing hidden among pine-blanketed hillsides, working as undocumented miners and creating their own society in the spaces between official recognition. They married, had children, lived entire lives in the shadows, but remained utterly secluded from the world around them. When someone from their community went missing, they would never involve outside authorities. A police investigation might uncover far more than just the truth about a disappearance. It could expose the entire hidden community to persecution they had spent decades avoiding. The unknown girl from the cave suddenly made sense in this context. She hadn't been a rural shepherd's child who accidentally fell to her death. She had been part of the invisible community, and when she vanished, her people had searched for her themselves, following tracks that led to the same limestone shaft, where Eloy Campillo Perez had met his end decades earlier. But the girl's death had not been an accident either. The forensic evidence suggested she had been killed elsewhere, and then lowered into the cave with ritualistic care, positioned beside Eloy's remains, as if someone were creating a grotesque collection. The horrifying truth emerged slowly through careful analysis of soil samples, mineral deposits, and the testimony of elderly locals who finally felt safe enough to speak about the hidden community they had helped support over the decades. The unknown girl had not been the first child to disappear. Over the years, several young people from the invisible community had vanished, always during times of particular stress or exposure risk. Someone had been using the cave as both dumping ground and shrine, feeding victims to whatever presence dwelt in those depths. The limestone walls had absorbed more than just mineral deposits. They had soaked up decades of terror, grief, and desperate attempts to appease something that demanded regular sacrifice. Inspector Mendez's final report would remain classified for decades, but those who read it learned that the investigation had uncovered evidence of a serial killer who had operated across multiple decades, targeting the most vulnerable members of society, the people who had no official existence, whose disappearances would never be reported to authorities. The killer had intimate knowledge of both the hidden community and the cave systems, understanding exactly how to make victims disappear without trace. More disturbing, the evidence suggested the murders had been committed by someone within the community itself, someone who had convinced the others that periodic sacrifice was necessary to prevent discovery by hostile authorities. The symbols in the deepest chamber told the story of this deception. Images of a trusted figure, always present but face obscured, leading victims into the darkness. Pictures of the community prospering after each disappearance, as if the deaths somehow protected them from exposure. But the limestone had preserved more than just mineral records. In the deepest passages where air circulation was minimal and preservation conditions optimal, investigators found fragments of clothing, personal items, and other evidence that painted a picture of systematic predation spanning decades. The final horror came when they realized the killer was still alive. DNA evidence from the most recent remains pointed to someone who had continued operating into the 1990s, possibly beyond. The methodical nature of the crime suggested someone with extensive knowledge of forensics, investigation procedures, and how to avoid detection. Inspector Mendez issued quiet alerts to law enforcement agencies throughout northern Spain, warning them to watch for similar patterns of disappearance among marginalized populations, but he knew the chances of identifying the killer after so many decades were minimal. The mountain had kept its secrets well, and some of those secrets would remain hidden in limestone passages that descended deeper than any investigation could reach. On the final day of active investigation, Mercedes Campillo Perez made one last visit to her father's gravesite. At 75, she had witnessed her father's vindication, seen his name cleared of collaboration with fascist forces, and learned the truth about his execution by former friends who had been driven to extremes by war and betrayal. But she had also learned that Eloy's death had been only the beginning of something far darker. The cave that had swallowed him had developed a taste for human tragedy, and someone had spent decades feeding that hunger with victims who would never be missed. Standing at the entrance to Torca de Topinoria one final time, Mercedes heard the familiar sounds: dripping water, air moving through passages, the geological conversations of limestone formations settling and shifting with imperceptible patience. But underneath those natural sounds, she still heard voices. Her father's voice no longer seeking forgiveness but offering warnings. The unknown girl's voice calling to other children who might be tempted to explore caves without understanding their dangers. And other voices, dozens of them representing all the people who had entered these depths over the centuries and never returned. The limestone would continue its patient work, dissolving and reforming, creating new passages and sealing old ones, gradually erasing the physical evidence of what had happened in its depths. But the mountain's memory was longer than human lifespans, and some stories would echo through those passages long after the last human voice fell silent. As Mercedes walked away from the cave for the final time, she heard one last sound from the depths, a rhythmic knocking that might have been falling stones, or might have been the mountain's equivalent of applause, acknowledging an audience, for stories it had waited so long to tell. The Picos de Europa breathed with their ancient rhythm, exhaling mist from countless hidden mouths, ready to swallow new secrets and preserve them in limestone archives that would outlast civilizations. The mountain was patient, the mountain was hungry, and the mountain was always listening for the approach of new voices to add to its eternal chorus. In the deepest passages of Torca de Topenoria, something settled back into dormancy, satisfied, for now with the chaos and revelation it had orchestrated, the limestone walls resumed their slow work of preservation and dissolution, waiting with geological patience for the next chapter in their endless story of human tragedy and mountain memory. The investigation was closed, but the hunger remained, patient as stone, deep as the passages that honeycombed the peaks, eternal as the limestone that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires and would witness countless more before the mountains themselves finally crumbled into the sea.